Welcome everyone to another episode of Adventures into Reality. Today I'm joined by Douglas Dwayne Dietrich and his executive producer, Laura Lee Solomon. Welcome to the show, guys.
It's great to be here. Thank you so very much for having us, and very much appreciate your taking us as a team, at least through the majority of the program. Laura Lee Solomon and I were dealing with a lot of our own schedule difficulties through the weekend, but we're really glad to, open it with yourself. And,
Very cool.
so thank you.
So, Laura, you're also you're Douglas's producer, and you're a hostess on your own show too.
Yes, I do Paths of the Great Adventure, which is about the sacred tarot and the Holy Kabbalah.
Very, very cool. And you're going to be assisting Douglas on some of the information that he's going to call with, so that people will be able to check up on what he wants to talk about.
Yes, and anything he wants to refer my way.
Yeah, and then we'll put all that into the show link so everyone will be able to get to that information.
Yes,
right.
All righty, so we're going to get started. So, Douglas, why don't you give the quick 1, 2, 3 of who you are? We have a very knowledgeable audience, and they may have heard Metro before, but for those people that are new, what is Douglas Dietrich?
Well, Douglas Dietrich used to be a Department of Defense research librarian in his first career. He's gone through essentially 3 careers, and he's entering what hopefully will be a 4th career, or mutate into a 4th career that will be at least a bit more peaceful and stable than how it started out, which of course was fairly dangerous in terms of the way I had to introduce myself publicly, but it was also a necessity, and that necessity is a result of what happened when I was a Department of Defense research librarian. So in that first career, which started remarkably enough, many people would think, when I was fairly young, I was about 16 years of age, and I was in the vocational institute equivalent of a high school, and it was around that time that I was, of course, also still a military dependent, which means that I had a dependent's ID card, which gave me access to open areas of any military base that were non-secured in the United States or outside of the United States, so long as they permitted military dependents or family members onto the base. As a result, I qualified for getting a summer job with the Department of Defense library that was on site, the Presidio military base. I started off as a librarian's aide or assistant, and then quickly worked my way into the position of military reference technician, and then later fully a Department of Defense research librarian. So during that period of time, my responsibilities were primarily documents destruction, and that of course is a form of cultural genocide, a lot of the deconstruction of our history, and in a very real sense, a deconstruction of our reality. Now, the problem of this kind of magic, if you will, and it's a form of magic, and I know many of our listeners are very familiar with the occult. Many of them are practitioners of magic or researchers thereof, and there is a true magic in how we interact with the universe around us. Many people who are more familiar with the esoteric traditions of Buddhism in particular, they know, of course, of Maya, not just the culture of the Mayan Indians, but Maya, the Hindu-derived word for illusion. Much of the world around us is illusion. We interact with a reality that we create on a quantum level, and magic itself, of course, is a right-along memory program for rewriting and re-entering the codes, the game codes, the cheat codes, if you will, to that reality that help reconstruct the reality around us. Now, most magicians, magic being spelled, of course, as many of your listeners know, with a K at the end to define real magic and discern it from legerdemain, or stage magic, or prestidigitation, simple sleight of hand. And with the magic that the federal government was involved with, particularly the United States military, it was rewriting all of history. Now, this magic was very potent because the kind of documents destruction that I was engaging in rewrote history for the practitioners, and the practitioners began to believe the history they were rewriting. Now, there's a real problem with that. They begin to react and act on a basis of a historical paradigm that was not in conjunction with everyone else's historical paradigm or the historical paradigms of a baseline reality itself. And as a result, they continually lost every war they were involved in, from Korea through Vietnam, through Iraq, through Afghanistan. So all of this is based on an insistence that their original cultural genocide and the fabric of a pseudo-reality that they reconstructed was real. So as someone who was in the front lines of this cultural genocide, this deconstruction and reconstruction of a pseudo-reality, a delusion, which served its purpose, it imposed upon the American tax-paying electorate, which provided the military junta which runs this republic, its income, its money. Every single year, our Congress appropriates well over half the discretionary income of the federal budget to the United States military. Now, all of this occurs because of a delusion. There's a delusion that the United States military won the Second World War. There's a delusion that we don't consistently pump in enough money to maintain them at Second World War levels of mobilization, that the republic is going to collapse. And then as a result, of course, the public continues to maintain that delusion with a fervor, because now they're emotionally invested in that delusion. It is their reality. But on a metaphysical level, it is inapplicable. It's impractical. That means it does not practically work. And it's as delusional as the application of pseudoscience to the mechanism of flight.
Absolutely beautiful, Douglas. You are talking everything that I've said from your own authentic perspective from those military documents, because we do live in a deluded reality. And some of the stuff you were talking about involves the Trading with the Enemy Act, the Alien Property Act, the War Powers Act, all stuff that people have no idea have been slipped into our history back from the earliest days in 1913, when they spoke in front of Congress, saying exactly what they were going to do over the next 20 years. And the two wars we had, millions died off, that lost the way that our laws were written, their original purpose, because each war was designed to eliminate people, to bring a whole new set of people to reinterpret the delusion they were creating.
Well, that's one way of looking at it, and what that operates on is the paradigm that there was once something good and pure in terms of our constitutional republic and its ideals.
And in fact, it's not. Our founding fathers did nothing good for us. They started us under a spendthrift trust and sold us out.
Yes. Yes, so, well, that's quite true. And one really has to wonder about the insistence of many American people, and one understands, of course, their attempt to salvage. There's an attempt to salvage what one can in terms of trying to preserve some sense of identity. It's very important to remember for everyone, much of what the power that's supposedly attributed to the American empire, which is this ultra power, this unipolar world power, there is no doubt that in a very, shall I say, skewed, ephemeral fashion, the United States empire, or the American empire, the empire of the United States, does seem at first glance to stand astride the world. It's got bases everywhere. However, the amount of manpower that's involved in the military is incredibly minuscule. And people don't understand that less than 1% of the American population today is in the military. And the only reason that we have as many veterans as we do is because of our involvement in wars that were massive in their commitment, such as Korea and Vietnam. Comparatively speaking, Iraq and Afghanistan comprise very small commitments in terms of manpower. The commitment that we've undertaken is in terms of infrastructure, supposed reconstruction. All of this, of course, is diverted into the pockets of various contractors, which do nothing for Afghanistan, do nothing for Iraq, and of course the end result is one has to ask, well, with all the money going into the military, okay, it's going into technology, obviously. Most people can comprehend that. They can wrap their minds around that. Obviously, there's very little men on the ground, and therefore they try to compensate with a lot of technology. Now, as a result of so few men on the ground, we have a far larger veterans population than we do an active duty military population in active service. And they're shrinking that as much as they can, so they have less and less veterans to pay benefits to. Now, very little goes to veterans' benefits, and the majority of what we have goes back to defense contractors. So most veterans live in squalor. Most veterans live they have a terrible quality of life. And as a result, people might ask, well, we got this fairly large veterans population. An enormous amount of them, indeed the majority, are homeless. Then we have the situation of veterans, so few of them on active duty. So how is this power really maintained? Is this power maintained by a methodology we don't understand? Then they escape back into the fantasy of hyper-advanced technology. But the reality is that America's tenuous hold is so easily snapped and will inevitably snap. And when it does snap, all of that is going to snap back on America. And at that point, people might finally begin to ask, how did this happen with all of the money?
And this is where your bigger story of being a public informant versus a whistleblower.
Yes.
You know, when you become a super whistleblower, you're taking away the rational impotence or the cognitive dissonance people have to the facts that we live in a world that is running very diluted.
Yes. You know, I really appreciate your taking in that direction, because this is where I began to leak information, which is what, of course, was a very dangerous move to make. The difference between a whistleblower and a public informant, and this is a title that I have, in a sense, coined, or a term that I've coined that hopefully will become more of a publicly recognized and used turn of phrase. The reason that it came into being was because of the examples that reinforce people's sense of impotence. This is the rationalization into impotence that people have. People want to look jaded, faded, and sophisticated. That's a big part of our age. It's a result of the Findicicle that came about at the turn of the century, back in the 20th century, back at the time of the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th. They came up with the term Findicicle, or it came into vogue from the French, of course, and this had a lot to do with a sense of aesthetic, and it had a lot to do with a kind of decadence, but mostly it had to do with a disillusion and a disappointment that people were feeling, and it became very fashionable for people to be cynical. Now, this, of course, was compensated for by a lot of very radical ideologies that were able to mobilize the population with a fervor that it basically was a reaction to this kind of apathy. Now,
fanning the zealots' fire for their purpose.
Yes, and what we have in the United States is the worst of both worlds. We have everyone is cooperating with the empire, and they cooperate with the empire on the rationalization that the empire is omnipotent, it's omniscient, it's all-powerful, and that it is useless to struggle against it. This is where the whistleblowers reinforce that. So the problem is you have whistleblowers who, for all intents and purposes, apparently, evidently, are the real thing. In other words, they're sincere. So you have these sincere whistleblowers, and I'll give you some examples. Julian Assange, Chelsea Manning, formerly known as Bradley Manning. I believe his first name is Edward, Mr. Snowden, Edward Snowden, formerly of the NSA, and of course someone no one has ever heard of, Jeffrey Sterling. Now, Jeffrey Sterling is part of a statue, unknown to most people, that has been built in Germany. Now, in Germany, they are honoring these whistleblowers, rightly so, as the victims of a totalitarian government. This is Germany's big FU back to the United States, because the United States does everything they can to build monuments that are anti-Teutonic or Teutonophobic, meaning Germanophobic, or indicative of something that's antithetical to the anti-culture, what the Americans consider themselves not to be. Whether someone is conservative or whether someone is liberal progressive, the one thing in common with these so-called different ends of the political spectrum is that all Americans call each other fascists and Nazis as a derogation, as a pejorative, and the reason that they do that is because they've all been raised with the concept of the National Socialist manifestation of Germanic culture as the ultimate evil. Now, America has no real culture all its own, and I'll say that quite bluntly. It's basically...
And I very much agree with that, because we have been imprinted to believe this false reality. And when World War I and World War II came along, the imprinting after the reconstruction from the Treaty of Versailles and then World War II, the imprinting of taking away that Teutonic structure so that they could no longer connect to those sacred special concepts.
Yes. Yeah, so that they could no longer identify with a inherent cultural heritage that was something that was a product of their environment. Now, the Americans have a European descendant culture, European emigre culture, and for the most part, despite their claim towards being something new and authentic, they are very transatlantic oriented. There's very little in the American mindset that has given proof of itself or has manifested itself as internationalist or global, which is one reason why it's failing so miserably as a global empire.
Because it wanted give me your tired and your poor, so we can put a foot stamp on them and charge them money.
Well, that's one way of looking at it, and but another way of looking at it was when they said, "Give me your tired and give me your poor." Nobody said give us your tired and poor from Africa or Asia. So they were taking them out of, or for that matter, from the southern regions of the world. They were taking them all from Europe, and Eastern Europe was considered quote unquote bad enough or colored enough. So as a result, what the Americans wound up with was a highly European culture. They called it a melting pot. But this melting pot was still very transatlantic, very Europa-centric, and what it has resulted in, perversely enough, is multiple attempts to remold their homeland of Europe, because they are a cultural construct, a Frankenstein's monstrosity of European emigres who left Europe because of their dissatisfaction with Europe. So you have people,
our founding fathers wanted to have ancient Greek as our original language.
Well, there we have that. Now that is fascinating, and it's an excellent point, and it goes back to, of course, the founding fathers and their Masonic heritage. We will go into that in a moment, but I don't want to lose the differentiation between whistleblowers and public informants. So I'll cover that right now. In Germany, because of just that kind of antithesis that we've been articulating, the need for European emigre descended North American culture to define itself, to find itself, to identify itself and establish itself in the world as something that is not European. It is so desperate to do so because of its fleeing from Europe, its flight from Europe, its migration. It has recreated itself as an anti-European culture from its participation in the Napoleonic Wars, which led to the War of 1812, as the Americans call it. But the War of 1812 was an integral part of a global conflagration, the world's first total global war, known as the Napoleonic Wars, or more properly as World War Zero. And during World War Zero, at the time of the Napoleonic Wars, the Americans squarely sided with the Napoleonic Empire, which itself was a product of the American Revolution, a direct offshoot of the American Revolution. French were here to help the Americans establish their republic because of their battles with the British on the North American continent. Once the American Republic was established, the shot heard around the world in 1775 resulted in the spark that set off the French Revolution. Ours was first, the French Revolution was second, and that led, of course, to the establishment of the Napoleonic Empire. Now, many people will speak of the benefits of that empire, of which there were many. It was not a church, as so much of the Europe was of the classical identity was founded upon. It was rather a court. It was a court of many new and progressive ideals based on an exceptionally radicalized revolution out of France that took the American Revolution to extremes which the conservative Americans had never anticipated, extremes which resulted in a new calendar, which will bring us to wartime later on in this conversation soon enough. But the French attempt to reestablish a new 13-month calendar was too impractical in the immediate modern world of the time, and it failed. A imperium was constituted, and at the head of that imperium was a totalitarian dictator, Napoleon Bonaparte. Now, far more horrible were the results of the French Revolution, which were genocidal. It was the most murderous regime ever put forth in France's history, far more so than Vichy France under the Third Reich. And during that period of time, the French had to dispose of millions and millions of bodies that were a direct result of that violent revolution. This resulted in the development and the deployment of charcoal ovens. No one remembers this. Now, who was on the side of the people that were employing the charcoal ovens to prevent the spread of plague because of so many bodies being produced by so much incredible violence in class warfare in France? Who was on their side? The Americans, the original conservative insurgency. And these Americans, of course, backed up the Napoleonic Empire, which resulted in an invasion by the conservative monarchies of Europe, the Anglo-Dutch Empire. They didn't have the manpower to invade North America, and so they deployed their Canadian colonials. And the Canadians invaded the United States, they defeated the United States, and they burned the capital of the United States to the ground. Now, Americans hate it when I say this. Americans will literally go into convulsions, paroxysms of rage, when I impress upon them the fact it wasn't some elite Royal British Marine Commando unit that set Washington aflame. It was the Canadians, born and bred, and they came down, defeated the American army, defeated the American forces, burned down the Capitol, burned down the White House, which at that time was pink, appropriately enough, and of course it had to be rebuilt. When it was reconstituted, rebuilt, it was reconstructed as a White House, when originally our Capitol and the President's home was, as I said, quite appropriately pink. Now, in terms of all of this, this was a disaster, and so the Americans fought in the first total global war, World War I, and they lost. After that, they had World Wars I and II. Their entire identity is defined as anti-European. This is why we have the statue in Germany today in a European response to American totalitarianism, honoring resistance fighters against that totalitarian American empire. And the statue comprises three people standing on stairs, standing up, so to speak, taking the risk, taking the fall that those chairs represent. These are very thin, four-legged chairs. They're not thick stool structures. This is a metal statue, but it's comprised of figures standing upon very fragile-looking chairs that are meant to represent the fragility of the situation which they took the stand upon and from which they fell. Now, the three statues that are presented in this statue, the three figures, are those of Edward Snowden, Chelsea Manning, formerly Bradley Manning, and, of course, Julian Assange. Now, a fourth empty chair is present there because it represents the invisible man, the man no American knows of, the African-American known as Jeffrey Sterling. So what happened with Jeffrey Sterling was he was a whistleblower who was one of the few African-American field officers, case agents for the CIA. Now, no matter what anyone says, when it comes to the CIA, far more so than the FBI, which has its own terrible record of racial equity and equal opportunity hiring, probably the worst offender of all is the CIA, because they can afford to be, because they're a secret, covert intelligence agency. No one knows that they're hiring inequitably. So as a result, one of the few African Americans they ever hired in their entire sordid history was Jeffrey Sterling. Jeffrey Sterling was made aware of a terrible operation with an occult code name, Operation Merlin, in which the Americans were attempting to sell faulty nuclear processing plant facility parts to Iran. This would have resulted intentionally, if they were integrated into Iranian nuclear production facility systems, it would have resulted in a meltdown similar to Chernobyl or Fukushima Daiichi. And this would have created an ecocidal disaster, which the CIA hoped would kill millions and millions of people, irradiate Iran so that it would become uninhabitable through vast parts of its nation, a chain reaction that would melt down all of its nuclear processing facilities, that would render all of Iran uninhabitable for millennia to come, maybe millions of years to come, so that no one could live there. This was beyond genocide. And it's similar to what the Americans are doing in Iraq with their deployment of depleted uranium, except on a far more immediate scale. And so he exposed this, if you can even imagine the enormity of this operation, to the world. He made a couple of press agents and reporters filthy rich who wrote about this in best-selling books. They were protected by laws that protect journalists. As a whistleblower, no one stood up for him. The journalists abandoned him. Nobody knew about him. He was true to the African-American experience as described by Harlan Ellison, not the science fiction writer, but the African-American author, in his book, The Invisible Man. So Jeffrey Sterling remained invisible. He was put on trial, and to condemn him as an African-American traitor, they brought in Condoleezza Rice to say, I work for the U.S. government, and there's no racism in the U.S. government. Okay, the fact that she was physically probably sleeping with George Bush Jr. aside, which is evidenced by a number of things we can go into later. That's more gossipy than it is newsworthy, but nevertheless, it is decisive because she was brought into the circle of neocons for reasons that are quite sordid. And Condoleezza Rice is brought in as a character witness against a fellow African-American so that he can be condemned to the rest of his life in prison, which is where he is now, and he will die in prison. Jeffrey Sterling is sentenced for the rest of his life into a concrete hole. No one knows about him. You've never heard of him, even though he saved the world. Saved the world from a nuclear meltdown disaster, a chain reaction that was meant to take out a nation, that meant to exterminate a people that would have impacted the rest of the world's environment. And now, this man will never be heard of, the true invisible man. So that chair represents him in Germany. Everyone in Germany knows it. No one in the United States who looked at that statue or visited Germany would ever know what that empty chair represented. And they might recognize Chelsea Manning when he was a man, because the statue looks fairly ambisexual. They might recognize Edward Snowden. They might recognize, of course, Julian Assange. And what happened to those other whistleblowers? Well, of course, Julian Assange is spending the rest of his life under house arrest in the Ecuadorian embassy in London. If he steps outside of that, the British will arrest him, send him over to their masters, their former colonies, which have become their lords and masters, the Americans, who will put him in Guantanamo Bay and torture him to death. And, of course, you have Chelsea Manning, who is being tortured to death. Former male, now a female, recognized as such, and a Marine, a fellow Marine. And this individual, of course, dared to whistleblow something and will spend the rest of her life in jail. And then, of course, we have Edward Snowden, who will spend the rest of his life in exile in Moscow, living in cheap hotels amongst the snowbanks, as opposed to the palm trees of Ecuador, which he could easily have defected to. Though it may not have protected him from assassination, it would have been a pleasanter way to die. Instead, he'll spend the rest of his life in Moscow in the back hip pocket of Vladimir Putin, who can whip him out at any time and use him as a chess piece or pawn to poke into the eye of any presidential administration that succeeds Barack Hussein Obama. So,
to challenge the propaganda that they're putting forth.
Quite so. Now, in terms of all of these men, what do they demonstrate to the American public? The American public says, look at all these whistleblowers. You can't win. They stand up, they say something, and look at their fate. It is a fate worse than death. So when you have someone like myself, a public informant, come forth who has been leaking information all of his life, disseminating information first covertly and then overtly to try and connect the dots for the American people, to put it in the narrative so they could understand the importance of this information, how do the American people respond? They kill the messenger. They hate the messenger. And, of course, the way that they maintain themselves as jaded, faded, and sophisticated so they can rationalize themselves into impotence so they don't have to take any action is to say everything Douglas Dietrich says is false because otherwise he'd be like Julian Assange. He'd be like, well, Edward Snowden. He can't know anything. He would be dead or in prison. Take a look at the journalists, investigative journalists like Michael Hastings, who worked for the Rolling Stone. He reports on a general, brings a downfall to this general's career. My executive producer, Laura Lee Solomon, may provide the name of that general, but it's almost unimportant. It's really not important to the narrative, other than the fact that this general was responsible for a lot of illegal drone strikes, which were so scandalous, killing so many people at funerals and at weddings, that finally, just for humanitarian reasons, they had to get rid of him. And now, Michael Hastings himself was killed. He died in a car accident that was beyond suspicious. It was physically impossible. It was actually a result of a drone strike. And McChrystal was the name of the general. Thank you, dear lady. Surname spelled M-C-C-H-R-Y. S-T-A-L. Now, with General McChrystal and the downfall of his career, we had Michael Hastings enter the public eye, but briefly he was given many awards posthumously and that were highly important to any journalist. Would have been an honor had he been alive. The problem was, of course, he was dead when his car blew up. When it blew up, which it doesn't normally do. Anybody who's very familiar with automobiles, whether they're police, whether they're truck drivers, whether they're paramedics, or whether they're car mechanics, can tell you a car almost never blows up. And his engine,
not without something to make it blow up.
yes, and his engine block flew through the sky over 100 yards. Well, over 60 feet away. I mean, these are very heavy items. They don't just fly like that. Even if your car does blow up, they don't fly through the sky like that, and certainly not when you simply crash into a tree. So obviously, this is an individual who was a victim of an assassination. Iris Chang wrote The Thread of the Silkworm, talking about the persecution of a Chinese-American scientist who was so disgusted with suffering throughout his career that he finally defected to communist China and created a missile system that could take down the United States fleet. One ship at a time, but nevertheless deployed en masse as it would be in a state of conflict. He definitely would be one of the decisive factors technologically for bringing down the entire United States Navy. This was proven in a series of war games, the most expensive war games ever waged in human history, known as Operation Millennium Challenge. Operation Millennium Challenge took place, I believe, around 2012, and around that time they brought General Van Ripper, a United States Marine Corps general, out of retirement. He, in the war game, deployed Silkworm missiles from sailing ships, little sailboats, and pleasure cruisers, and he converged in kamikaze attacks, suicide runs, admittedly, against American carriers, destroyers, missile cruisers, multi-billion-dollar high-technology craft, and sank them all to the bottom of the sea in the war games, resulting in a naval damage that made Pearl Harbor look as unto nothing in terms of its damage to indeed it destroyed the American Navy. Now,
it revealed that the corporate infrastructure and military-industrial complex had sold a bill of goods, just like the nuclear weapons that didn't work throughout history.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. All of this high-technology infrastructure to reinforce delusion, all part of Maya, all part of the magic that keeps you under, and, of course, whenever this is exposed by someone like myself. Now, General Van Ripper ultimately resigned from the war games in disgust because the Pentagon would not act on the results. They called into play what's known as Deus Ex Machina, which means God of the machine. They simply erased all of the results. They hid them from the public. They re-enlisted all the sailors who deserted during the war games. They basically brought back to life all the sailors who, quote-unquote, died during the war games. They resurrected all the ships and refloated those that were sunk during the war games. Now, all of this is virtual, but nonetheless, the results would be very real in actual combat. And Deus Ex Machina is impossible.
Because they all use the Aegis interaction system, so it was a live war game, even though it was a virtual live war game.
Quite correct. And it was a war game which the United States, of course, reversed all the results thereof because their entire infrastructure is not to fight a war, not to win a war, but simply to make defense contractors rich and to keep
to project power and imprint something onto the rest of the world.
That's quite correct. But when the rest of the world stops buying it, and the rest of the world doesn't buy it, rather the Americans do, what the rest of the world does is they tolerate it. They tolerate it because there's an economic intercourse with the United States that is valuable to them to maintain. Everyone is dependent on the largest market in the world, the United States market. The fact that their sailors and their soldiers go around and bully the rest of the world means nothing to those who are not bullied other than a sense of humanitarian repugnance. Nevertheless,
all the military bases have the highest rape structures in the rest of the world. Every military base throughout the United States has the worst crime rate and meth rate, so on and so forth.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We're talking about a so-called war machine, which is, the people might say, well, the similarity to the United States is not at all a World War II situation. Anybody who would be a think tank expert, a critical analyst, would tell you that the United States imperium, its situation is far more similar to that of ancient Rome, classical Rome, in the sense that it is surrounded by quote-unquote barbarous empires or barbarian empires on its frontiers, but it is in no danger of head-to-head confrontation, which Rome, during its days of head-to-head confrontation, faced the rival Mediterranean empire of Carthage in North Africa, and they very much came close to losing. They
had three separate wars, the Punic Wars.
That's
yes.
quite correct. Hannibal came to the point of almost destroying the Roman capital, Rome itself, Roma, and he threatened that capital through the Alps with his elephants, the armor of his day, in such a fashion that when the Romans responded, they responded genocidally. That was
Pliny the Elder, delendo es Carthago.
Yes, thank you. And the Romans, by responding genocidally, that was their concept of World War II. But they were far wiser than the Americans. They knew they could never withstand such a conflict again. They never sought such a conflict again. Every conflict that they sought after that was against frontier peoples who could not match them technologically or in terms of organizational discipline. As a matter of fact, that really needs to be emphasized. It wasn't technology that won Rome. It was its military garrison state infrastructure, its discipline.
Gaius Marius in the implementing of the first public army that didn't require you to come with your own shield and sword.
Excellent. Thank you, sir. And with that, they had a machine that was at least unmatchable to armies that were not of equal discipline. That's one of the reasons why Emperor Caesar was murdered. Emperor Caesar was murdered because Emperor Caesar was going to go to war against the Parthians. The Parthians were the Iranians, the Persians. He was going to go to war against them, which would have brought Rome victory under a man like Caesar. I have every confidence he likely, with all of what he had going for him, won that war. But here's the problem. While it would have made Rome truly eternal, would have been around probably to this day through the intercourse it had with China, through the acquiring of gunpowder, through the fulminatum, as the Latins referred to it as, which they knew of. They knew of the gunpowder. But by
the use of Greek fire, too.
Yes, and the ability to mass produce it that they would have inevitably learned by domination of the Silk Road, they probably would have become a true empire to this day. And yet, what everyone was fearing was what would come after that, which would have been potentially head-to-head conflict with China. Now, no one wanted another Carthaginian-style war, and therefore Caesar was murdered. So, for that reason, the world has come to us historically the way it has. But at the same time, one of the things to emphasize is the Americans are not that wise. They never learned that lesson. They would basically prefer to believe they won the Second World War, and as a result, they keep refighting it. This is why every time they invade Iraq, every time they invade Bosnia, wherever the Americans invade, the same pattern develops again, where they divide it with allies in a coalition warfare. People need only to take a look at the military sector maps of Bosnia, the military sector maps of Iraq. There's this psychotic redivision of these nations under military sectors similar to those of the occupation zones of Germany on ceasefire. And you have to ask, why do they keep doing this? What sense does it make? Why it's this desire to reinforce the magic, to reinforce the delusion that the Second World War was won. And therefore, by continuing to reinforce this again and again, the Americans reinforce it not for the public, who never knows about this. Nobody in the general public takes a look at the military sector maps of Bosnia. They don't take a look at the military sector maps of Iraq or any of these other nations, Afghanistan, anywhere else. What the Americans are doing is they're reinforcing the delusion for their military staff. It's the
Exactly, because they had television and radio, where in the ancient days they didn't have television and radio. They only had the notes that your generals and soldiers had. So what you're talking of, the recreation of delusion, has been done in many centuries before to enforce the projection of power. But now we come into a world of mass media, where that mass media can project the propaganda to a bunch of people who are zealots falling into their own belief system.
Absolutely correct. But take a look at the nuance of what I was articulating. The nuance that I'm articulating is that this redivision of these conquered nations that the American military imposes itself over, it's not being done for the sake of the public. The public doesn't see this. The public doesn't care. This is for the magicians themselves. It's the military staff. And so when they see this, they get this reinforcement of their delusion. And as a result, it is the magicians who are starting to believe the stage magic. It's the magicians who are believing that they truly are in power. This is the horror. This is the madness. And as a result, the public, it's different. What the public doesn't see are these sector maps of Iraq or Bosnia. What the public sees are Snowden, Assange, Manning. And they say, well, whoever exposes this has to be a shill if they're not in jail. So they create this absurdo, shall we say, reductio absurdo argument, which is it's a reduction to absurdity. And what they have done absurdly is the American public has created a no-win situation in which they can rationalize their impotence, because the American public has a horrible affront that they put forward with their need to appear jaded, faded, and sophisticated, a legacy of Findicil, where they come forth and they say, I know it all. I'm streetwise. I'm savvy. And you can't fool me. And I'm a responsible adult. Nothing could be further from the truth. They're infantile, and they're entirely ignorant. But they're
classic American bravado.
Yes. And so what they do to reinforce this is when someone like myself comes forth and says, this is all the delusion. This is the narrative in which so much of this has been destroyed, all this information you don't know of. But what you can look up, you can find elements of what I'm saying. They're incontrovertible. They can't be hidden. If you look this up, this is the narrative in which they fall, and your world will make sense. And you can awaken, and you can break out of Maya. You can break out of this delusion. You can overcome the magicians. You can deconstruct this military. And everyone, of course, wants to destroy me. And it's not the military. They don't need to. Their public does it for them. They're dupes. They're willing dupes.
Exactly.
Who want to believe that they're powerful, who want to believe that their military is undefeatable, who want to believe that the government can't be beaten. So they go forth and they say, you don't know anything, or you would be like Assange. You would be like Manning. Well, let me put this into perspective for people. This is a whistleblower. A whistleblower is a tool. He is a dupe. He or she has been used, and then they are dispensable, they're disposable, they're expendable, and they're made an example of in order to defeat you, the public, from ever aspiring to resist. Because you, as a jaded, faded, sophisticated, quote-unquote, responsible citizen, you as an adult continually claim that if you had power, if you could stand up, you would stand up for what is right. Nothing could be further from the truth. If these people were all like in Britain, of course, they had a young man who was a soldier who was murdered in front of their eyes. In this case, 2 colored Muslims ran him over with a car, then got out of their car, and they cut his head off. Now, I don't remember the young man's name. My Executrix producer will look it up. But this individual was attacked in front of hundreds of Britons. And they all stood back, police and all, and wept and cried and shuffled their feet nervously and looked at their toes, and none of them did anything. That's what Americans would do. So as a result, no matter what happens in front of your eyes, you as an American are impotent. You will do nothing, not because the other person has power over you, but because you are powerless inherently. You are inherently impotent. And see, these 2 colored guys with butcher knives who cut this guy's head off, the crowd could easily have torn them apart. But nobody lifted a finger because they're scared. The Americans are that way because they want to be that way, because then they can go home and pop beer and pretzels and watch football games, as opposed to standing up and doing something which they constantly decry as evil. Your average American shouts his lungs out saying, oh, I hate drone strikes. Oh, these drone strikes are terrible. Oh, I hated it when they bombed Vietnam, when they napalmed Vietnam. My own psychiatrist, I'm openly treated for post-traumatic stress disorder. My own psychiatrist is Vietnamese, and her face, of course, is terribly scarred, so burned. She has to wear a porcelain mask whenever she appears in public. And her skin is so burned by napalm that her bones show. You can see her calcified bones through her face and through her arms, where the skin is showing. It's terrible, and she is a victim of American imperialism. She's a victim of the empire in Vietnam. And if you say, we were defending her from communism, how on earth can you say that when you look at her now? How insane can you be? Communism is better than that. How?
War is hell, and America is projecting the war hell to imprint to the rest of the world to create a sense of fear.
Well, they know this. And so most Americans say, oh, I'd like to do something. And but the protestations are meaningless. Your so-called right to free speech is meaningless. If you had any sense, you would know that. You just look at Julian Assange, you look at Edward Snowden, you look at Manning. What did free speech do for them? There's no such thing as free speech. You're free to say that which is not threatening. The moment you do something threatening, there are going to be terrible repercussions. Now, I've faced those repercussions, but there's a difference between me and the others. See, the others...
This what makes you the public informant.
That's correct. In terms of the others, the whistleblowers, you take a look at Julian Assange. His personal history is highly questionable. The man actually sources from a UFO cult, and he is from Australia. You take a look at his family, and they all intentionally, artificially bleached their hair jet white. They all have worn sunglasses all their lives. They were all part of this very bizarre cult, and he still affects those physical mannerisms. He still bleaches his hair white. He still wears the sunglasses. He's a product of a mind control cult. He set up WikiLeaks. What happened with his most damaging, quote-unquote, leak? He got it from Bradley Manning. Bradley Manning was what was known in the vernacular as a prison bitch. He was a homosexual who was openly homosexual in a military that had a don't ask, don't tell policy. Now, he was effeminate enough. He had cross-dressed during his time as a Marine, so people felt he looked sexy enough where they were willing to physically copulate with him. He was effete and effeminate enough where they didn't want to waste him deploying him in the battlefield, so he became the pillow wench for all of these generals and officers.
At the CENTCOM in Riyadh.
Yes, and he was basically servicing sexually colonels, generals. They pillow talked to him like a bed wench. He basically found himself with the opportunity to steal a bunch of information. Now, what kind of information did he steal and give to Julian Assange? State Department information. Now, he's a private. He's a private. It doesn't matter that he's a private first class who's sexually servicing a bunch of officers. What matters is, what would a bunch of officers be doing with State Department information? Military doesn't have State Department information. Somebody gave him all this State Department information. This is called hemorrhaging. So they hemorrhaged him with a controlled leak. With his controlled leak that he gave to Julian Assange, they presented to the American public, we've murdered well over 1 million people, at the very least 1.5 million by the time that he gave that information out, which was like, oh, at this time, about a decade ago. And at that point, even 10 years ago, by now, there must have been 2 million, 3 million killed in Iraq. But at that point...
I think it's closer to 5 million.
Thank you.
And something I want to add is the sexual abuse scenario that you're talking about is common through the military, through all militaries, and has been done for hundreds of years, the sexual servicing of the officers.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And
it's ingrained into the culture.
Absolutely. Absolutely. This is a prison rape culture. This is not a war machine. That's the difference between the Roman Empire, or Pax Romanum, the peace of Rome, and the United States. Not
they took the slaves, made them sex slaves, and if you watch the movie, the series Rome, you'll get a very visceral understanding. You were tied up to a pole and you had sex all day until you died.
Yes. Well, the difference between the Roman Empire, as brutal as it was, as inhuman, as reprehensible as it was, nothing to emulate, I assure you. But despite that, they had a working war machine, a garrison state. What the Americans have is a jail dodge. They've got a jail dodge and a welfare state. It's not a military. It's not a war machine. This is not a machine meant to wage war. It would lose every time it's on the field, and it always does. So what you have is an American war machine. I'm not talking about necessarily individual battles. Obviously, there is a share of heroism. There's a share of some level of accomplishment on the battlefield by exceptional individuals in the United States military, just as you have honest men who are in the American prison system, who are, of course, innocent victims of a justice system gone awry, and therefore inside of a huge prison system, proportionately the largest in the world comparative to its baseline population, you're going to have innocent men in prison. That's the same thing with the military. Yes, there are some heroes in the U.S. military. The majority of the United States military is a jail dodge and a welfare state. It is not meant even as a garrison state. It's an an exportation of ghettos. One of the men who died in Bosnia, assassinated during the Clinton administration, was Ron Brown. What was Ron Brown? He was the head of Housing and Urban Development, the man who builds low-income Section 8 housing for Americans to live in ghettos in the United States. What the hell is the head of Housing and Urban Development doing in Bosnia? He's building ghettos for troops. This is what you do. You export your ghettos. This is your gift to the world. Other people build cars.
And this is exactly why when you have an infrastructure of bases around the world where you have the highest levels of crime rate, the highest levels of rape, sexual abuse, drugs, Satanism, all of those other things that really project the power forward.
Yes. And so when you've got Ron Brown dying in Bosnia, that truly says it all. And nobody bats an eye. And then you have, but that exposes what your military is truly all about. The fact that you've got someone from HUD going over there, helping to build military bases, which are nothing more than low-income housing, and you're getting rid of your major crime problem. You're helping to bleed it off with an overflow population that would otherwise be breeding at home with more and more impoverished people with no option to move up in the world other than crime. This is what you're doing. This is what you export. This is your gift to the world. But beyond
And it creates an ever-ready group of more people ready to go into the military because they're raised as military kids.
Yes, absolutely. That's part of the problem. Just as people raised in ghettos grow up what? On welfare.
Right. Or their only way out is football or the military.
That's right. That's what, which is the same thing.
Yeah, it's the same thing, exactly.
Yeah.
Except there's no guns, but you're still getting hurt.
Yes, that's right. And football is it's only moderately better. I mean, it may be better, but it's so short term. It's so many problems with it. We've seen that there's a movie out now about concussion, which talks about these people are truly expendable. They're abused. They're exploited. There is no glamour to football when you're an actual football player. You'll be waking up the rest of your life.
I have treated healing scenarios with many ex-football players, and the stories you hear and the abuse that you see on the body is just insane.
Yes, thank you for that. So yes, football is not an option that is, I would consider, even a good option. I mean, is it worth it to be wealthy and have a home and have been through that when you're going to wake up the rest of your life feeling like you've been hit by a truck? I mean, that's and you wake that way out of the military, you wake that way out of the football league, etc. But definitely, my point with the whistleblowers, the difference between them, we've seen what happened to them. We've seen them used as controlled leaks, like I brought up about Manning and Julian Assange. And the horror of it was what was exposed. They exposed that they murdered over 1.5 million people in Iraq. Now, that's not exposing anything. They didn't tell anyone anything that no one with any ounce of common sense would not have assumed. You would have to be an idiot not to have assumed that 1.5 million people had not died in Iraq by that point in history. You would truly be blind, deaf.
I think if you look at Desert Storm 1, they accidentally said there were up to 3 million Iraqis that died in just the big sand barrier, and that's Desert Storm 1.
Mm-hmm. I really appreciate you bringing that up. Yes, and what we have is a situation in which, yes, the American people are not just blind and deaf; they're ultimately dumb, and that's right. The horror of it.
Cognitively ignorant.
Yes, and so with that, to kind of deconstruct the horror of Manning and Julian Assange, who are victims. They are victims. Then you take a look at Jeffrey Sterling, again, a victim. Then you take a look at Edward Snowden of the NSA. This man according to the NSA themselves, officially, the NSA has stated he stole everything. And by that they said everything in all caps. He stole everything. What has that done to him? Why is he not
Nothing.
leaking this? Why is he not using this as some kind of tool to keep himself alive? What good does that do him? He is forever...
Let alone to keep him in champagne and caviar.
Yes, yes. Instead, the man is a tool. He's a slave to Vladimir Putin. He's Vladimir Putin's bitch. He's on a leash.
Yep.
He's basically stuck in Moscow. He doesn't have security because the American ability to assassinate people overseas is extraordinarily limited. Venezuela, of course, being the exception that proves the rule. Hugo Chavez may well have been injected with cancer, but the man, and you can inject someone with cancer. This has been around for quite some time. But Hugo Chavez was, for all intents and purposes, right next door. And, of course, take a look at Fidel Castro, who is literally within swimming distance. People have swum to escape.
The 90 miles, exactly.
Yeah, and here's this individual who's been alive forever. Now, there may be conspiracy behind that. There may not be. The reality is it is very difficult to assassinate people overseas. Some people who are closer are easier to hit than others, but most of the people who get knocked off are domestic. Very difficult to assassinate.
Because they don't have an infrastructure of loyalists protecting them.
That's correct. And the same with some guy who's living over in Russia. It would be very difficult because America's CIA, this is one reason why they were able to fire and persecute someone like, say, for instance, Jeffrey Sterling so easily. You have an example where the CIA is all European Americans. This is why the FBI, when the Twin Towers collapsed, they had no one who spoke Arabic. They finally got a Turkish woman who wrote the book Kept Woman, I believe. I'm trying to remember her name. My Executrix producer, Laura Lee Solomon, should be able to get that for myself. But she is a woman who basically was employed by the FBI to translate Arabic. She was ethnically Turkish. So this tells us the FBI had not a single Arab person working for them. And this woman ultimately exposed the fact that they wanted none of her interpretations. They didn't want to hear what she had to say.
Because they were classic white Anglo-Saxon Protestant and Mormon.
Yes, many of them, and many of them were just, they're just a bunch of white guys who are frat boys, and these guys, CIA, FBI, whatever they are, these are your classic frat boys.
Who have been recruited through the Greek system of scenarios, which has its own abuse built in, so it can make predators.
Yes, absolutely.
An infrastructure of predators.
Absolutely. So the difference between myself and Sybil Edmonds, thank you, dear lady, my Executrix producer, I could not live without her. She is certainly my memory where mine fails. And Sybil Edmonds is the classified woman. That's the title of the book, Classified Woman, not Kept Woman. So my apologies to all females in that regard, and which has an entirely different meaning. So in terms of Classified Woman, that is a book to read, heroine of mine. Hope to interview her someday. And in terms of the result of the whistleblowers, we see the result. The result is, as you yourself would say, a imprinting of rationalized impotence on the general public. By seeing this, they say, well, somebody who is saying what Douglas Dietrich is saying, if it has any glimmer of truth, he would be dead or in jail. Okay, it doesn't work that way. The way it works for a public informant, someone who's been leaking, like myself, information all of my life, is you build up a collateral.
Dirt.
Yes.
Just like the mafia, they've got dirt on every senator, politician, and it's literally its own information is being weaponized to protect yourself.
That's correct. And it's a form of terrorism. Now, it's also important to emphasize the fact that I am a criminal by all legal definition because I violated national security regulations. Now, this is a different kind of law breaking than your average pathological criminal. I am a conscientious criminal. So,
conscientious objector who's been criminalized because of your knowledge and wisdom of what you've learned.
Thank you. And that's a very, I would say, positive way of putting it. Indeed, it's a flattering way of putting it. But let's put it in as practical and as blunt a fashion as possible. The bottom line is I am an example of why terrorism works. And it can work politically, not militarily. Now, let's take an example of this. Militarily, what do the Americans and now the Israelis, what do they work with? Long-distance bombing. long-distance bombardment, whether it's artillery or ordnance or whether it's by plane. Both the Israelis and the Americans have taken to bombing them from 20,000 feet in the air. Now, anyone who doesn't think the Israelis use actual bombers is entirely unfamiliar with the Intifada in Lebanon. So trust me when I say this. There's a lot of aerial bombardment, whether from the apartheid state of the white settler regime, of ethnically Turkic, and this is what most Ashkenazi Jews are. They're descended from the Hazars, Turkic peoples. Ethnically, the people that they have displaced are Semitic, Arabic and Semitic. This makes them the most anti-Semitic nation on earth, which is part of the irony of their establishment of an apartheid regime that persecutes Semitic peoples. So you have a situation in which they employ terrorism. They employ terrorism through Mossad, through assassination. They employ, and Mossad is the Hebrew word for the institute, and they employ, of course, terrorism by their own form of artillery bombardment, their own form of missile strike, their own form of aerial bombardment. Now, the Americans emulate them. The Israelis may be masters of terrorism, and the Americans follow thereafter, emulate their masters, and the Americans, of course, do the same thing, and it always fails. It always fails because you cannot militarily sustain a campaign of terrorism and expect it to work. If the population is not genocidally wiped out, the population will stand against you. They will respond, and they do.
Yes.
And ultimately, their very survival is a victory. This is why you can't buy people. The finances don't work. The Americans have, theoretically, more money than anybody. Supposedly, many of the world's currencies are pegged to the United States dollar, and yet the Americans could not buy out the Serbs. They could not buy out the Vietnamese. They could never buy out the National Socialistes who ran the Third Reich. None of these people would sell out to the Americans. Otherwise, war would be unnecessary. You would just buy out your enemy. But nobody buys it. Why does nobody buy it? Because identity is infinitely more important than wealth. And
so well put. Oh, I love that line.
Yes, and of course the Americans have no identity, which is why Americans sell out every day, and they can't understand why no one else does. That's why they say, oh, they hate us for our freedoms. What's an American's
They hate us for our bravado and ignorance.
Yes, but beyond that, what's an American's idea of freedom? The ability to buy anything you want.
Based on how much money you have in your pocket and if you can get in line before someone else.
Yes, and that makes you more free. That's why the wealthy are more free than you are. Right. They don't go to jail.
That's why it's a $4 cup of coffee here versus a 3-cent cup of coffee somewhere else.
Oh, so true. So true. It's insane. But the end result is, when I'm saying this, it's not just decrying the wretched state of anti-cultural conditions in America. They don't have a culture. We don't have a culture in America. We have an anti-culture. And the anti-culture mostly establishes itself by saying, we're not Nazi. We're not European.
Right. That's the projected propaganda culture that many of the local governments take on. And then your local factions will make their own anti culture, like there's inner city culture creating rap or country going so forth, and then following their imprinting and creating their own subcultures.
Or skinheads, which is
that
reaction.
Exactly.
Yeah, this sort of countercultural reaction, but it's all based on a stance that's antithesis. Oftentimes, as opposed to something that stands for something. It's very hard to get somebody to express what they stand for. They're much more difficult than getting them to say what they stand against, which is easy to say.
Right. I remember in high school Jewish kids that were trying to be Nazis.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I can.
And the whole craziness of it.
Mm. Well, it's almost understandable, really. I mean, but
yeah, in its own right, yes, because it's such a diluted world.
Yes, so truly. Beyond that, we might go into the history of that someday. Certainly, the state of Israel would have been impossible without the failed Reich and its sponsorship of the Zionists, because the Zionists were a militant movement of the 1920s that were crazy enough to want to go back to a strip of arid desert in the Levantine, which everyone else in the world thought only the lizards want it, and everybody was wondering, why would anyone want to go live there, it's unlivable. It's basically uninhabitable.
Because they wanted to project 80 years of culture ahead of them. They wanted to imprint over many long periods of time, take information from the Templars, redefine the history. They knew they were going to kill 100 million people in 2 wars, and the people growing up would believe the history books.
Well, there you have it. And the National Socialistisch, and before them, the Italian Fascisti, or the fascists as the Americans know them.
And they never, and then Mussolini never really surrendered.
Yes, that's right. Well, they supported the Zionists to get them out of Europe. They were the only Jews who wanted to leave. So as a result, they got financial support. They got training in agriculture. Does anyone truly think that Jewish people had any history of agriculture in the modern world? There was no history of agriculture for modern Jewish ghettos, which were entirely urban. So it would be the equivalent of resettling your average African American in the middle of Africa, where he has absolutely no concept of how to hunt, how to gather, or how to take advantage of the environment around him because he grew up in a ghetto. So it's the same with the Jews of the ghettos of Europe, and that's what they called them, the ghettos of Europe. And so these Jewish people suddenly find themselves, where did they get the training in armored warfare? From the likes of Rommel and Guderian. Where did they get their training in agriculture? From Heinrich Himmler and the Schutzstaffel, which trained them in how to farm land. This is how they were able to turn the desert into a garden. These were the products of the failed Reich. They were supported by the fascists and the National Socialists to get them out of Europe, and the rest of the Jews that wouldn't leave paid the price. Now, in terms of what we have with the United States, we have a situation, of course, in which they don't understand any of this history. To them, they interpret it from a quasi-theological level based on ignorance, from a interpretation of a Bible, which itself was purged by a king in England to create the King James Bible in simplified English from the original Hebrew and Aramaic and Syriac.
Right, and then you have the Old Testament, and you have all sorts of other versions that were left out of it.
Absolutely. We have the Apocrypha.
Recreated history, what you've been saying since the beginning of the interview, but on a much bigger scale.
Yes, well, on a cosmological scale. They left out the Apocrypha. They left out many other aspects of the Bible. Now, in terms of what we have with what I was talking about with back to the public informant status. So the difference between myself and these terrible victims is that I have collateral. And this is where the terrorism comes in. Now, it's important to emphasize this because it needs to be contextualized. In contextualizing what I've done to show you the impotence of imperial superpower terrorism, bombardment does not work. When you're bombarding civilians, when you're killing women, children, elderly people in their beds, infants in their cribs, this kind of terrorism does not work. It mobilizes the population against you. It rallies them. Terrorism is not a viable military strategy. The only real war-making strategy is to send warriors to defeat warriors in the field. The Americans,
true boots on the ground.
Yes, and the Americans have never been able to do that effectively because they're not a warrior culture. They're a bully culture. Therefore, all they can do is bomb, occupy, terrorize, very much the basis that Israel has with its surrounding neighbors, and the end result is that everybody hates them. The end result, of course, is what you see. This has not worked. Terrorism does not work by you. Where does terrorism work? Here's an example of where terrorism works. It's on a political level. You may not militarily win, or in any way, shape, or form enforce your will or project your dominance by terrorism, but you can change that around you politically. Terrorism is used against people all the time with political results. This might be exemplified by, say, for instance, what happened in Japan. Japan had a relationship with Iran. The largest population of foreigners in Japan are Israelis and Iranians. And they battle each other in the streets, sometimes killing each other. And other than for that, Japan is the most crime-free nation on earth. Of all the crime committed in Japan, statistically, demographically, 100% is committed by foreigners. The Yakuza, or the criminal mafia of Japan, the samurai mafia, conducts most of its violence and its crime overseas, in the Philippines, Southwest Asia, outside of Japan, in Indonesia, other points. But in Japan...
Because they have deals with their local government to not cause problems in the streets.
That's correct. And
which is goes back to the original history, starting as gambling organizations that paid off the local protectorate so that could exist as a subculture.
You are very well versed, and I am impressed. Almost no one in the West knows that. The samurai mafia of the Yakuza, when they are pressured too much by police forces in Japan, actually protests in front of the United Nations. They have actually done this historically. So then the police let up because they don't like external embarrassments. Now, this is the kind of quid pro quo between the ethnic Japanese amongst themselves to contend with the need for some kind of criminal undercurrent or black market, and it's been around.
So you say ethnic Japanese. You mean the traditional Japanese versus those that have, let's say, Belizean or Chinese added to their culture?
Well, by that I would mean the what the Japanese call Nihonjin. If you ever hear the term Nihonjin, that means ethnic or racial Japanese, as opposed to Nipponjin. Nipponjin would mean a citizen of Dainippon or Greater Japan, a citizen of the empire, because Japan, most Americans and Westerners are entirely unaware of this, is not just a multicultural nation, it's a multi-ethnic nation that
Correct.
is...
And that's why when they call Ganjin, where they're saying that it's a derogatory term, is meaning you have no ancestral connection to the land whatsoever.
But also it would mean that you're a foreigner who's unfamiliar with the culture. And its culture, of course, Japan is loaded with many Chinese, many Okinawans, many, by ethnic Chinese, I mean mostly Taiwanese. I was born in the island of Taiwan, or island China. And, of course, you have Koreans. There are enormous Korean communities in Japan, enormous Chinese communities, mostly derivative of the island of Taiwan, many Okinawans. And this is, it sounds contraindicative or contrary to what I said about the largest foreign communities in Japan being Israeli or Iranian, but let's further the nuance. These are the largest communities of foreigners to the immediate East Asian culture, which Japan has derived its culture from for thousands of years. So in terms of these new foreigners, they are responsible statistically and demographically in homeland Japan, within the 7,000 islands that comprise the Japanese empire.
7,000 islands, iterate that, yes.
And,
important to understand.
Yes, it is.
Because when Japan came out of its cultural perception and America says it was a closed-off culture. No, it wasn't. There was thousands of Taiwanese and Chinese that were part of the dojo systems of training.
Yes, that's that. And also the Ryukyus Archipelago, which comprises Okinawa and the various other islands within that system. Taiwan itself, an island almost as large as Japan, was part of the Japanese Imperium for well over 100 years. And so we have, of course, these various other elements of Japan, including the Caucasians that comprise the Ainu, or the indigenous peoples of northern Japan, or Hokkaido. These are Caucasians, and they are called anthropologically by a terrible name, the hairy Ainu, but that's the actual anthropological term because, of course, like most Caucasians, they have far more body hair, or are far more hirsute than many Orientals, quote-unquote, or ethnic Asians. So we have this entire multicultural, multi-ethnic nation of Japan. It's very large, larger in land area than Germany, larger in land area than the United Kingdom by far, larger in land area than France, and yet the Americans think of this as this small island, but they had a very heavy relation economically for the oil with Iran. Then, of course, due to finances and Wall Street, they had a large Israeli population. They were basically fighting each other in the streets. There were the equivalent of gang wars. And ultimately, what happened was Japan refused to place sanctions against Iran. Now, Israel considered it...
Which ultimately challenged the petrodollar where we are today.
That's right. And, of course, the Israelis responded with Stuxnet. What is Stuxnet? Stuxnet is the virus that was designed specifically by Israelis and Americans in a cybernetic version of the Manhattan Project. They got all the specialists, the hackers, everybody they could get together, and they created an artificial virus, a malware virus, which could take out industrial control safety systems that were used over the majority of the world by anyone who was running nuclear reactors. So,
and this connects to your earlier story about Iran being sold faulty equipment, because Stuxnet was supposed to be involved in that from the very beginning. So it wasn't just the Iranian reactors, it was anyone else that was going to be using that reactor technology.
That's quite true. And here's where we get into it. Why does Israel consider Iran such a threat? Lebanon is to its north, and what happened with Lebanon was that it was a crusader state that was originated, as you well know, by the Knights Crusaders, the Templars, the Hospitallers, the rest of the crusading knighthoods and orders of chivalry, and they created Lebanon as a safe haven for any Arab or Semitic peoples who converted to Christianity. So it became a Christian crusader state comprised of an Arab population. What happened was these Christians allowed Arabs who were being persecuted by fellow Muslims to come into Lebanon, and these were Muslims who were Shia. Most Muslims who are Arab are Sunni. Persians or Iranians are Shia. And so what happened...
So you're actually talking about when the Ottoman Empire was falling apart and there was the redistribution of the cultures.
There was that, and then after World War II, it got worse because France was colonizing Syria, Lebanon. Beirut was the Paris of the Middle East. It had casinos, dance halls.
Right. It had all the mafia, the things that needed to service an army.
Yes, that's right. And then what happened was, of course, many of the Lebanese Christians gave shelter to many Arabs who were fellow Semites, fellow Arabs, who were Shia, who were being persecuted by Sunni Arabs, who were in the majority. These Shia Arabs settled in, ultimately took over Lebanon. There was a horrible civil war between the Christians, the Muslims. Hezbollah means Army of God, is a Shia army of Arabs who follow the same religion as Iran. That's why they're considered a satellite of Iran, which is why they're a direct threat to Israel, because Israel feels that any nuclear technology from Iran will be brought in through Lebanon. That's why they want to destroy Iran's ability to make any nukes. So they got together with their American slaves who worship their Zionist masters as the chosen people, and what they did was they said, we'll create a Stuxnet virus to take out the German industrial safety control systems manufactured by Siemens. And Siemens is a huge multinational conglomerate or corporation centered in United Germany. Siemens is a German company that's quite old and established. Siemens manufactures the ICS, or the industrial control systems, for nuclear breeder reactors that it sells all over the world. So what will take out a reactor in Iran will take out a reactor in Japan. So
the classic Mark I reactors that were created by GE.
Thank you. And thank you to both yourself and to my executive producer for both of your knowledge on all of this. Now, I want to remind people that in terms of what was going on with how they got Stuxnet, the malware virus, into the nuclear breeder reactors, was they got it into the personal computers of the technicians in Iran. They took their own little computer databases, their external hard drives, their various little chips from their home computers where they took their work home, put it back into the computers at work where they had their breeder reactors. It got into the system, shut down the industrial control systems, and created a nuclear meltdown.
Information terrorism at a different level, once again.
That's right. And it changed, of course, the course of history in that sense, but it did so far more through Fukushima Daiichi. Later on, when the tsunami hit Japan, 20 minutes before the tsunami hit Japan on 3/11, that's their version of 9/11, March 11th. And in that particular year that Fukushima Daiichi took place, that nuclear reactor meltdown, it took place during March 11th, their version of 9/11. They look on it as a terrorist attack. They look on it as a conspiracy. And when that tsunami hit, 20 minutes before it hit, the nuclear reactors would have gone into self-shutdown mode. But
right. It was actually those those Mark I reactors were literally designed to automatically shut down under even if a mouse farts.
Yes, and what happened was Stuxnet kicked in, and it was traceable. It was traceable because the Stuxnet malware virus, once it hit Iran, then its imprint was traceable wherever it infected its industrial control system. So they knew it was Stuxnet, and it kicked in 20 minutes before the tsunami hit, shut down all the ability of the ICS, the Industrial Control Safety Systems, to go into automated shutdown mode. So they couldn't shut down. So when the tsunami hit, the reactors ruptured and meltdown occurred. So this was an act of terrorism that has impacted Japan for eternity. All of the course of history is going to be changed. The Japanese are going to have to adapt to relocate their culture, which means they have to remilitarize. They have to remobilize so much of their...
Which they just voted for.
Yes, which much of their... so that much of their population can be relocated either into space through special colonization or more immediately into territories that are more amenable around them. Now, such as Manchuria, which is, for all intents and purposes, highly underpopulated and very much a rust belt. And so we have this potential for further conflict in Asia, but what was accomplished by terrorism? The Japanese voted not to have any sanctions, or voted for sanctions against Iran. So the Japanese were forced to vote for sanctions against Iran on the basis...
And they lost all their petrodollar contracts, too.
Yes.
Trillions of futures in dollars.
Yes.
That's why their stock market tanked and tanked and tanked.
Yes, on the basis of Israeli-American terrorism.
Wow.
So this is where terrorism works. So this is what makes me a public informant. What I use is a form of terrorism. Now, because I broke national security regulations, just like all of those men you see, Edward Snowden, just like all of these men you see, like Julian Assange, all basically, I am considered a criminal. Now, because of that, how do I keep myself free? Why am I walking? Why am I not either killed or rotting in a concrete hole? Because I'm also, for all intents and purposes, by definition, a terrorist, because I have taken an instrument of terror, which is my collateral against the United States government. So what makes myself a public informant was the fact that this government was so corrupt, so incompetent, as it always is. Your military in no way, shape, or form is an operational machine. You take a look at the men who run the Strategic Air Command. These are the men...
You'd be lucky if you had one brigade that was truly ready to do something.
Oh, God, and everybody hopes for that. They fantasize for that. Of course there's units that are capable of projecting a great deal of professional force and acumen. These units have been disastrously and intentionally misdeployed to destroy them. This is like Delta Force. Delta Force was an elite counterterrorist unit that during the time that President Jimmy Carter tried to deploy it to rescue American hostages being held captive in Iran, then the former head of the CIA, George Bush Sr., the man who was running the CIA when Carter became president. Carter approached him and said, I'm your executive commander-in-chief. I've seen UFOs. I've heard also other things about UFOs. What's the skinny on them? I hear that Asian Pacific Islanders are prisoners of war, were killed in atrocities that involved Roswell. And, of course, one of the things that he brought up was the total corruption of the American military, which made it look like it was a military atrocity as opposed to anything extraterrestrial. A great example was, of course, the man who was in charge of the mortuary. The man who was in charge of the mortuary ran the Roswell Museum till the day he died. And the man who was in charge of the mortuary, whose name I actually forget, it's almost non-essential to the narrative. My executive producer may look that up for me. But what everyone remembers about him was the fact that he got orders for child coffins. During the time that the Roswell incident took place, the military base, which was then an army base, ordered all these child coffins. And so when all of this was brought forth as to why they need these child coffins, of course they needed them for Asian Pacific Islanders who are very short. The overwhelming majority of Japanese, all of them as a matter of fact, down to demographically 100%, were vegetarian. They ate fish. They're vegetarian. They're not vegan, okay? So they ate fish.
Right.
There's a big difference. So they were vegetarian. They didn't have the protein that would make them as tall as your Japanese person is today, which is equal to that of most other peoples. But in terms of that time, your average Japanese person was 4.5 to 5 feet tall.
In World War II, was right around 5 feet tall was the average size.
Yes, correct. Or a little shorter. And the aeronauts, like pilots all over the world, were much shorter. And preferred to be so to fit in a cockpit, to be able to escape, just like from a submarine or any confined vehicle, they were preferred to be smaller. So we're talking about the average Japanese aeronaut being about 4 to 4.5 feet tall. So
this is what allowed them to blame it on the UFOs.
That's right. So when they brought these child coffins in, later on, people were asking, decades later, what about the child coffins? And what did the Air Force say? At that time, it was the Air Force that was running what used to be Roswell Army Airfield. It was now an Air Force base, and then it no longer existed because it was moved to Texas, and Roswell's industry is based on the alien tourism, quote unquote. Now, in terms of the reality, of course, they approached the Air Force, which is incredibly stupid because the Air Force didn't exist at the time of Roswell.
Yeah, it was still the Army Air Force.
It was still the Army Air Corps, right? And the Army, but all these people that they approached were specifically involved with the 509th Bomber Group, the Atomic Bomber Wing, which was at Roswell. So they asked all these guys who were in charge of what was the world's only atomic bomb delivery mechanism system, the only so-called, this is what they claimed we're the only atomic wing in the universe. And so here's these people who are responsible for delivering nuclear weapons, the only people in the world supposedly capable of doing so. The man who was the Roswell mortician was Glenn Davis. Thank you, Laura Lee Solomon, my executive producer, knew about the recovered, quote-unquote, alien bodies from the 1947 crash. Now, in terms of them, they were all, of course, Japanese prisoners of war who fought for the Empire of Japan. ethnically, of course, many of them were Okinawan or Taiwanese or even Korean. And, of course, they spoke Japanese just as the way many Scots or Irish or Welshmen or people from the Isle of Man would speak English. So, but no Asian person would easily tell these white cultures apart, and no white culture could easily tell these Asian cultures apart. And simply because they all spoke Japanese just the way Welsh, Irish, Scots, or Manx peoples would speak English, everyone assumed they were English-speaking English or Japanese-speaking Japanese. Quite the opposite is often true, and foreigners find it impossible to discern. But in terms of all these Asian prisoners of war, 1,500, 1,500 of them were in the United States. None of them returned home alive. They all died here. And in terms of that death, the child coffins, hiding that evidence, when questioned about it, and Davis's affidavit has just been put up on the link has been put up on the text box in front of me through Skype. But
and I'll have that in the show description so everybody can look at all the information we talked about.
Sure, excellent. But in terms of what we're talking about with the Roswell incident itself, when questioned about it years later, the people who were actually there, the officers of the 509th Bomber Group, and they said, what about the child coffins? They said to the reporters on record, openly to the public, for public historical record forevermore, they said, that's because we all drink. And we use all these child coffins to smuggle in the booze so the enlisted men can't get it. Now think about what I'm saying here. Everybody, think about what I'm saying. What these people who ran the only atomic bomber wing in the world by their own claim are telling you is they drink on duty. Because they're
revealing the culture of nepotism and all those other words, isms that define the military abuse culture.
Yes, I mean, beyond that, in your face, they tell you this, and everybody just sat back and just said, oh, okay. And nobody
believed them.
Nobody said, wait a second, you're an officer. I mean, you have watering holes outside of, like, I'll tell you something, like Nelly, Nevada or something like that. There's this Nellis, there's this town right outside of Area 51. And it's a watering hole for everyone who works at Area 51. Everyone who is Cuban or Chinese or Russian goes to Nellis to go drinking so that they can juice all the mofos who come out of Area 51 when they get off duty, because they all go there to drink. They all get plastered because everybody buys them free drinks who's from Cuba and Russia and China, and they talk about all the private stuff they worked on, and before you know it, you've got Aurora model kits building stealth fighter bombers, issuing them before it's even admitted that a stealth fighter bomber has been built, because you've got people who work for these companies as well as all the Chinese and Cubans and various other communists like Russians go over there back in the day when we had a Cold War, who just found out everything they wanted by getting these engineers and military guys pig-faced drunk at the watering hole down in Nellis so that they could tell everything about what they were working on when they were at work. So all of this is known to everybody because these people have no concept of secrecy. They have no concept of professionalism. They're totally incompetent, corrupt. They're moronic. And, of course, they're government, so they can't be fired. So they go out there and you get them pig-faced drunk, and before you know it, you've got all the blueprints. This happened again and again and again. So what these officers are telling you is even worse, because they're telling you we're not going off to Nellis or our equivalent of a watering hole, because every military base has its own bar. Every military base has a bar for people to drink in off duty. Why would you need to smuggle booze? There's only one reason. You're drinking it on duty. What these guys are telling you is we're officers. We're in charge of deploying your atomic arsenal, and we drink while we're on duty. We drink so much that we have to smuggle it in by the coffin.
The TV show MASH, where they were making their own alcohol, is the classic example of how the military ran at that time.
Yes, well,
and when you go into Iraq and Afghanistan, they learned all the new ways of self-brewing alcohol. I cannot tell you the amount of stories of people that got really screwed up on homebrew alcohol all throughout Afghanistan and Iraq.
Oh, yes. But beyond that, of course, they're using aerosol duster that is a computer cleaner. They're inhaling that. They're huffing it. It's just everything you can imagine. It's the normal kind of abuse from people in a hopeless situation at the enlisted men's levels. At the officers' levels, they all drink. So at the officers' levels, you've got these guys drinking on duty when they're supposed to be deploying atomic bombs on a moment's notice. Now, you go beyond that to the Air Force, when it did become the Air Force, and they realized, of course, that all their enlisted men, all their officers are so drunk, so high, so moronic, so incompetent, so uneducated, so just plain lazy, they cannot accommodate a different launch code every day, which was in theory what was supposed to be happening. They were supposed to have a different launch code every single day of every day of the week, 365 days of the year, so that no one could go in and just casually launch all the missiles and generate a nuclear conflagration that could wipe out mankind. Well, of course they couldn't handle that, so they changed the launch code permanently for decades to 8 zeros. They've had 8 zeros.
And this is what has perpetuated this other UFO myth that the UFOs can come down and disable all of the nuclear weapons instantly. That's just a way for the military-industrial complex to say, oh, our weapons really do work.
Yes, absolutely. Part of the magic, part of the propaganda as instituted by, of course, propagandists such as Michael Aquino, who was a PSYOPs officer who I worked with as a Department of Defense research librarian under orders. I worked with him for well nigh a decade, close to 8 years. So you've got this situation where, of course, all these people who are going to work, so to speak, I mean, that's what the Air Force is. And by the way, the Air Force has no planes. There's more planes, fighters, bombers, strikers, etc., helicopters, anything you can imagine. There's more of those in the Navy than there are in the United States Air Force. The Air Force has no planes. The Air Force is all missiles, and it's all underground. It's all ICBMs. So they all sit in the most comfortably designed ergonomic chairs for 8 hours a day. It's just like a 9-to-5 job, only it's 8 to 4. You go there with a suitcase. You go into the nuclear missile infrastructure. You go down the tunnels, the tubes. You go down the tubes. That's appropriate enough a term. And when you go down the tubes, you sit there with another guy, and you sleep the day away. And, of course, you wait for the order to launch a missile. Now, they can't launch the missiles anymore because anyone could hack in anytime and launch the missiles, so they have to hotwire them. So if the orders came in, they would have to physically emerge, hotwire the missiles to be able to launch, because otherwise any hacker could do it. Why? Because back in the old days, they proved themselves so corrupt and incompetent that the launch code, which is much more direct and mechanically, electronically wired to the missile directly, separate from a computer system, which was digitalized and, of course, hackable at that point.
Right, because it was still an analog system.
Thank you. In those days, of course, you had these men who weren't going to change the code every day and reset the code all over the United States every day. So it was just 8 zeros. Now, McNamara didn't find about Secretary McNamara of the Department of Defense didn't find out about this until well over 20 years after his retirement. When he found out about it, he flew into a rage. He couldn't believe it. But that's the culture of corruption. Now, these same people, Strategic Air Command, that's what that is, Strategic Air Command, these same people approached Kennedy during his first year in office when Kennedy became president, and they said, Mr. President, we have a missile gap. That's how we came to this whole missile scam, where they've got this huge missile system. So the Air Force came in, they said, we got this missile gap. Look at all these photographs. And they laid out all these photographs in front of President Kennedy, and they said, look at this. And they pointed to every single grain silo, every single war memorial, every single church spire in Russia.
Because there was no one else to fact check that.
Yes. And they said, this is from our satellite photographs. And they had reconnaissance satellites in those days, back in 1961.
Yes.
They said,
dozens of them.
Yes, and they said, here's our U-2 flights. Here's all of this aerial reconnaissance photography. And they said, it's all ICBMs. They said all these structures are ICBMs. And they're all sitting on launch pads waiting to launch any second to hit us and annihilate us all. And they knew exactly what the Russians had. The Russians had 4, count them, effing 4 ICBMs. 4. And they said they had 1,500. They said they got 1,500 ICBMs. And that's when Kennedy said, oh, my God, we've got to restructure our entire educational system to build physicists and engineers, to build missiles, to close the missile gap. And that's how you became enslaved. The entire science of business, the entire business of science became restructured to accommodate a welfare state for engineers and a permanent employment program for physicists so they could keep building these missiles, which these guys sat with a launch code of 8 zeros for the next 20 years, doing absolutely nothing to launch because they wouldn't work if they got launched anyway.
Right. It's the nepotistic cult of the war machine of that we have.
It's treason. It is treason.
Oh, yeah, at many levels. I mean,
yes. So when these men did what they did to your executive commander-in-chief, their executive commander-in-chief, your president, their leader, their general, their top military officer, who was formerly in the military himself, a product of the United States Navy, who actually saw combat, John F. Kennedy.
Had a P-2 boat.
Yes. And when they went up to him and did this, they all should have been taken up, lined up against the wall, and shot. But instead, your entire future was ruined. All your money has been going into this ever since. This is high treason. This is corruption. And what is it that you have as integrated into the defense perimeter of every single Air Force base all over the world that belongs to the United States, even if they're what they call a lily pad, which means a single helicopter pad for a single helicopter to land on as a kind of relief and refueling station at somewhere in the Pacific or Italy or anywhere else. The one thing that's required as an integral part of the defense perimeter of every Air Force base of the United States all over the world is a golf course. They are a traveling golf club. So this is all the corruption, the incompetence that that grew out of your so-called war machine, this jail dodge and welfare state, this culture of absolute corruption. And these people were responsible in their madness, under their chaplaincy of Satanism. When I was assigned to work for Lieutenant Colonel Michael Aquino, who retired a full colonel, he was officially recognized as the satanic chaplain of the U.S. Army. He wrote the chaplain's handbook. You can vet this. You can look it up. That means all the rabbis, all the padres.
I have an interesting synchronicity for you.
Yes.
When it relates to, I remember right after high school, I was going to community college, and I met another person that was in John Carroll University in Cleveland, Ohio, which is a very Jesuit college, and he was studying to be a military chaplain specifically for Satan worshipers.
Thank you. Thank you.
Specifically,
Yes.
and this was in 1993.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you. And
he was recruited out of a Jesuit college.
yes. Thank you. Thank you. And this was very important because the reason they had Colonel Michael Aquino, the founder of the Temple of Set, himself schismatically severed from the first Church of Satan as established by Anton Szandor LaVey, the reason he wrote the Chaplain's Handbook was specifically so that all rabbis, all padres, all fathers, all deacons, all reverends would know when to step back and stand down whenever a Satanist stepped into the scene and administered satanic ritual to affect,
or how to deal with those people,
well,
or how to counsel them,
yes.
or how to not counsel them. I remember talking to this guy for hours and hours and hours, that his specific purpose was to study Satanism at all its levels so he could be a pastor to those Satanists that were already in the military, and there was a requirement and a job function military number for it.
Yes.
An MLS number.
Yes, yes. And people can look this up in the Chaplain's Handbook as written
Yes.
by Michael Aquino. So just look that up and you'll find the numbers, which Andrew Bartzi's states specifically. You can get the details. It's out there, and you can vet what I am saying. But the point is that because of this type of belief system, the official religion of the military mafia, they invested millions and millions of dollars, ultimately billions, just as they would into the missile system, into an occult warfare system.
Because they needed psychic and physical predators so that they can continue to project their power through terrorism.
Now, they did that domestically, and they did that through programs that created people like the Zodiac Killer, like Richard Ramirez, like various people like the man who was the hero of Black Hawk Down, Sergeant John Stebbins was his real name. In the movie, they changed his name to Danny Grimes. He spent the rest of his life in the Brig, a military prison in Fort Leavenworth, because of his raping underage boys. Now, the point is, what's he doing in a military prison? The Army will say, well, he did all that after he retired. Well, that means he should be in a civilian prison with all the rest of the baby raping sons of bitches. But no, he's in a military brig because he did everything he did under military control. He did it under orders. The Zodiac Killer left combat boot footprints at his murders. He was seen in combat camouflage. As for Richard Ramirez, he was a product of a system of psyops that was meant to mirror in the United States exactly what was going on with the Phoenix assassination program and terrorization of the population program in Vietnam. And the Phoenix program involved the Central Intelligence Agency, their terrorization of intellectuals, dissidents, people in the Republic of South Vietnam who were antithetical to the system as it existed and were considered a threat that would make it vulnerable to communist insurgency. This included anyone who was a school teacher who was basically telling children about why the war was going on. It's a terror. I mean, there were all kinds of nuances where a person could be turned in by an anonymous accuser, just like in the witch hunts, which would result in them being either interrogated and tortured to death or murdered in their sleep through the Phoenix program. The equivalent in the United States to keep the American population terrorized was the creation of serial killers. When I was working on base, one of our clients at the library was Master Sergeant Michael Ramirez. Michael Ramirez, of course, was somebody who was assigned to Letterman Army Medical Center for methadone treatments. Letterman Army Medical Center, or LAMC, as its acronym was pronounced, was responsible for training over a quarter, 25% of all military doctors in the United States, certainly all the Army doctors, and the Army doctors, of course, and any military doctors not subject to the Hippocratic Oath. Well, in terms of Michael Ramirez, he ultimately killed himself with a heroin overdose, but he had a shoebox full of memories he always brought with him to the library of all these girls he had raped to death in Vietnam and tortured in horrible ways. These photographs were quite graphic. He would always try to bring them into the children's room, and yes, we had a children's room. When I was on duty.
And we know this stuff happened from the My Lai incident that made it out during the 60s and 70s.
Yes, merely the most grotesque and the most widespread of incidents that were occurring everywhere, or the most far-reaching in terms of its implications. Now, in terms of these atrocities, they were quite numerous, and yes, Master Sergeant Richard Ramirez was a U.S. Army Green Beret, Special Forces, John Wayne all the way, and this individual was a monster. And this individual, of course, I asked him how he got sentenced to methadone treatment. He'd been sentenced in court of law. And, of course, he was, the judge went easy on him because he was a veteran. He was a Green Beret. He was supposedly, quote-unquote, a war hero. And,
he went through hell, blah, 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 all the other disillusion stuff.
Yes, and this individual, of course, told me, well, I blew my wife's brains out in front of my nephew. Well, who's your nephew, I asked. Well, it turned out his nephew was Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker. So his nephew would take that shoebox full of photographs and memories and take it to the graveyard in Los Angeles and whack off all night under the light of the moon. And that's what produced him. Also, these are all products of military psyops programs, these serial killers that keep the public terrorized and at bay. This is American Phoenix. This is American terrorization. So your military mafia terrorizes you. They take your money. They expend it on living the fat life, and the veterans get nothing. The veterans who live in the field now live on the streets, and the officer class drinks themselves to death amidst fat and plenty, ripping you off for so-called security. There's no security from these military men. They could disappear tomorrow, the entire war machine. No one would invade the United States, and if they did, they would face an armed population. Your defense is your right to bear arms. Use it. Your enemy is here. It is the American military. Deconstruct them not through violence, but by stop giving them money. Decommission them. Stop Congress from appropriating all the money to them and put it into veterans' benefits, education, health care. You would experience a golden age. So,
all stuff that I absolutely agree with. The golden age is there as long as you stop empowering the system of corruption.
Absolutely. So what happened with these military men? They created, with their belief in the occult, a series of passive binding mechanisms for extra cosmic weapons of entropic destruction, what they called entropic bombs, entropy, the cause of decay in the universe.
Oh, I love those words you're using. Now you're really getting me up good.
Yes, and Americans know this kind of system as HARP, an acronym which, of course, is somewhat of a misnomer, but basically it is a auroral projection system, high resonance. It is meant to affect the ionosphere as ionospheric projection, and, of course, we had a huge array system in Gakona, Alaska. Now they're all over the world. What are they for? Well, originally the one in Gakona, Alaska was meant to affect the jet stream. The Kuroshiwa, the Japan current, creates a jet stream. The jet stream goes at such a high rate, hundreds of miles per hour, that it impedes flight to bomb Japan. During World War II, all of the bombers trying to bomb Japan ran into headwinds, 300 miles an hour and beyond, that made them hit the floor, so to speak, and ride the waves until they reached Japan, drop their bombs, and of course they all got shot down by anti-aircraft fire. It wound up with thousands of Americans parachuting in Japan, being ripped to pieces alive by an understandably irate public. And those that were lucky got captured by the police or the military for interrogation, but out of thousands of Americans who parachuted in Japan, barely half a hundred made it out alive. And so the Americans said, what do we do to reverse the jet stream. So their creation was this array, but it never is turned on. The Japanese know exactly what it's for because that's what saves them in terms of radiation with Fukushima Daiichi. Fukushima Daiichi's radiation doesn't linger in Japan. It blows through the Kuroshio, the Japan current, and the jet stream over to the United States.
Right,
So
which has an esoteric infrastructure of sacred geometry cities to begin to collect and alter that energy and reproject fear back out to the world.
Well, there's that. And on a radioactive level, you might say, why don't they use the HARP array to change the jet stream and make it all go back to Japan? Well, that's because they can't use it for that because all of its energy is used as a binding passive mechanism, passive binding mechanism. And in terms of the passive binding, it involves these extra cosmic entities which they have summoned. Now, these are bound to these, through these mechanisms, to the geomantic ley lines of the Earth, which you just alluded to. And in terms of the Japanese, the University of Tokyo has set up online a monitoring system for HARP so that they can tell whenever it's turned on because that would mean the radiation's blowing back to them.
Thank you.
So for that reason, anyone who wants to check this out can just look up online with the University of Tokyo the HARP monitoring system and find out that it almost never goes on. And you say, well, hell, they've got the, what, it's not going, what is it doing? Well, it's there because it exists to passively bind through electromagnetic forces entities that have been summoned that...
Right, through the Dragon Triangle, because we're opening up to a whole different esoteric layer where they're trying to communicate to some higher form of energy being that's trading technology with them.
That's right. And
that ultimately wants what? Our DNA at a bigger scale.
Well, there's all kinds of interactions that it has, and the worst of it all is that these entities, by their very existence, our entry into our dimension, they deconstruct the fabric of space and time around them. They are truly weapons of cosmic destruction. We're talking
exactly. They are going to totally imprint this reality in their own function, and this is where transhumanism comes, where they're imprinting on our culture through our nepotistic military is to create beasts of burden, beasts of labor, beastly people who will take transhumanism to the next level.
These are symptoms. Yes, these are symptoms.
Yeah.
But the illness...
Symptoms of the corrupt culture that's being imprinted from an extra-dimensional force.
Excellent. Yes. Yes. And what keeps the force here is, of course, it needs to be fed. Aquino said it was very similar. The analogy he used was that of a very large man imperfectly cuffed to a banquet table, a buffet table, and by a thumb cuff at that. And that so long as he was fed, he would be satisfied. The moment he was no longer fed, he could easily overturn the entire table. This is what these entities could do to our inner solar system, not just our planet. And these entities would deconstruct the fabric of space and time around us within the regional area and well beyond by their unleashing. So what was to unleash them? A mechanism similar to the same kind of mechanism which your executive commander-in-chief, the President of the United States, uses to theoretically launch a nuclear war. The nuclear football, which every president had a Marine, an airman, a sailor, or an army.
The guy carrying the briefcase.
Yes, that they would switch the service every day, but the branch of service would always accompany the president, so at any moment, theoretically, he could launch a nuclear strike, or basically incept what would be considered an all-out thermonuclear war. Now, the equivalent to that was created to unleash all of these entities at once. That is what I stole, including its replicate mechanisms. That is my collateral of terrorism by which I walk free. And
because you have the blueprint to the esoteric side that is allowing the extra-dimensional entities access to our reality so they can alter it.
Well, the ability to unleash them in totality, which would theoretically entirely deconstruct the fabric of reality around us. This is something that many people will balk at and say, well, I don't believe that. This brings us back to the importance of what matters and what does not matter. What matters to you is meaningless. What matters is that the men with the guns believe this.
Exactly, and it has been truthful for many generations. Guns or swords or bows and arrows.
Yes, it is not the man with the gold who makes the rules, a.k.a. the golden rule. It is the man with the guns who makes the rules. So everyone...
And writes the history.
Yes, so everyone who is out there and says, I'm an atheist, or everyone out there who is not an atheist and yet still refuses to accept this within their cosmology, it doesn't matter what you think, what you believe, what you want. What matters is the men you pay your taxes to at gunpoint have invested their entire belief system into this concept. So what you believe is meaningless, they believe I have the occult equivalent of the nuclear football, which I do possess.
Which gives them the placebo power to manifest an imprint on our reality through our own ignorance of belief.
There we have it. And, well, what Andrew Bartzi's just said could be taken in many ways. What he said leaves an opening for the non-believer. It leaves an opening for the non-believer to say, okay, so what Douglas Dietrich is saying is that he's got a sugar pill. But if they believe the sugar pill, what does it matter? They're not going to touch him. So that's exactly the situation as it stands on a practical level. But
the weaponized information you have is the sugar pill for everyone else to realize it's a sugar pill.
Well, there we have it. And the information that I distribute can help deconstruct the horror. And that can be
beautifully put.
Yeah.
Deconstruct the horror. Because that's the big healing we'll have to go through.
Yes. And to begin to deconstruct that horror, get rid of the fantasy that you won the Second World War against Japan. Understand that you're still legally in a state of war with the Third Reich, which is why the Nazi propaganda is relentless in terms of anti-Nazism. They constantly say Nazis are evil. Whoever stands against us is a Nazi. Constantly analogies are made of foreign dictators to Adolf Hitler and World War II. The constant desire to refight World War II and redivide Germany, whether it's in Bosnia or in Iraq, is part of the American pathology because they're still legally at war with the Third Reich in exile. I was born with a republic in exile. I was born into one. I was born into the Nationalist Republic of China, one of the founding member states of the United Nations, which had to relocate to the island of Taiwan because of its betrayal by the United States to the communists. And because we relocated, we're not recognized by the United Nations, but we have one of the largest economies in the world. The majority, if not over practically all, of computer hardware the world over is constructed, for the main part, in Taiwan. And were something to happen to Taiwan, God forbid, it would impact the information highway worldwide irreparably.
Absolutely.
So we have a situation in which a non-recognized people and government is one of the major movers and shakers in the world around you. But you don't know this because you live in a delusional fantasy. Well, that's an exile republic. The World Anti-Communist Headquarters is headquartered there, and the World Fascist League, and, of course, the salute in that island of Taiwan with a population of 25 million people at ceremonies where people are sworn into political office, various sports events, etc., is the Roman salute. It is the fascist Sieg Heil. Now, no one knows this in the United States. They're totally ignorant of this, and they have no idea of what I was born into. Your Third Reich, which you are still at war with, is also in exile and physically relocated. The Americans are still legally at war with it, which is why you are still on wartime. It is daylight savings time, which was originated by Franklin Delano Roosevelt in World War II, or reinstigated. It was originally incepted by Woodrow Wilson in World War I and was kept on in effect for only a single year. And, of course, they got rid of it because it was impractical. We brought it back for World War II. We are still legally in a state of war. That's why you're still on daylight savings time or wartime. You can look this up. Roosevelt.
Which sets you up for the imprint of Roman numeral time being spread all over the world by American imprinting of war and terrorism.
Well, there you have it. And the only place the terrorism is working is on you. So,
right. So once they have an imprinted Roman numeral time, the outside extra dimensionals, who are in their own sense time traveling, have a moment in what I call fraud Roman numeral time where they can meet via mathematics.
There we have that. And I want to bring some positivity into this, Laura Lee Solomon, my Executrix producer, prior to perhaps taking a break, she has to leave us soon anyway, to do her own program, The Paths of the Great Adventure, on Studio A at Revolution Radio, which you can access at www.freedomslips.com, very late Friday night, early into Saturday morning. I want to bring her in to talk to us about the positive side of empowering yourself through HaKabbalah so that you can learn to take charge of your own life and enter a state of consciousness where you can overcome this constant terrorization. Laura Lee Solomon, would you please do that for us?
Oh, okay. I'll do the best I can with that. My whole take with my show is that people need to work on themselves to develop in themselves a sense of their connection to the universal whole. And that is what is being destroyed with all this fear and all this war. The whole effort seems to be to divorce us from nature and from that one force that actually creates and sustains all things, the Tao, as it were. And in order to cultivate that, there are both ancient and modern technologies that have proven themselves over time, so that if one, for example, uses the tarot, and I don't mean any version of the tarot, such as the Crowley deck or some of the more creative efforts. I'm talking about a classical version of the tarot, something akin to Waite's deck. Builders of the Adytum has a nice one, and they're one of those groups where you have to get the line-drawn cards and you color your own.
Right, the true alchemist cards that were from the 1400s to the 1640s.
Yes, they're very close to an unpublished original.
Yep.
And so, in using these as meditation pieces and then learning about them and what the archetypal language says, we start to develop an awareness that reconnects us back to the one and reconnects us to our souls. And as you recognize yourself as soul and as part of that overarching reality that sustains all things, you become, instead of fear-driven, you become peace-driven, and you become a place of safety instead of looking for a place of safety.
Right. You become a being that can operate truly with love without strings attached.
Yes, yes.
And once you get that highest level of empowerment, it's how you share your empowerment with others.
Yeah.
What is your theme for tonight's program with the Tree of Life?
Well, we're moving on from we're looking at the Rosicrucian grades of initiation right now, and I've spent the last 3 or 4 weeks looking at the grade of Zelator and the things you need to get about the real science, the real physics of what the universe is like. It's nature as an energy being of which you are part.
Beautifully put, wonderfully put.
Like a cell is part of your body.
Yeah.
In fact, as above,
entanglement.
so below, the cells as part of your body are intelligences that are your allies in this if you enlist them in a conscious way.
That can be converted over to another saying, your ancestral understanding of the 7 generations that came before you and your responsibility for the 7 future generations ahead of you.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, and by the way, I want to thank both of you. I was brought to my attention by my Executrix producer who's speaking right now that the Woolwich attack in England was against a young military bandsman known as Lee Rigby, a military musician. He was identified as the soldier who was beheaded by the 2 Islamic terrorists. Now, this brings us back to the terrorization, the culture of terrorism. We live in a state of constant fear. Obviously, no one has come here yet and done what could easily be done in terms of terrorism on such a scale that we have even blinked or batted an eye. When it came to 9/11 and the Twin Towers, the conspiracy is evident to anyone who begins to research it. The only questions or arguments or debate really concern the details or the mechanics or the engineering, but anyone who is truly investigating the world around him is conscious of the fact that an enormous conspiracy was involved, which of course involved the United States military, which of course had stood down for supposed war games that were taking place during the terrorist attack on 9/11. Now, to bring us out of this modality of fear and terrorism, we have brought forth, of course, what Laura Lee Solomon is talking about. Andrew Bartzies is helping to contextualize it, but let's get a bit from Laura Lee, and then I'll be happy to bring in what I know, perhaps after a short break. I'm not quite sure how much longer she can be with us, but I want her to ride it out for as long as she's able to be with us. Tell us a bit about what is the difference between what you're offering and the kind of magic that was used by the Freemasons, or this occult kind of conspiratorial magic, or the dark occultism of Michael Aquino, who I was able to learn from in terms of all the negative sides of the energy in the universe around us. So please take over from there.
Well, I don't know what the what the Masonic Order does, and I've never been a member of the Masonic Order. I was castigated rather severely when I was in Air Force basic training by a squad mate who had been in Eastern Star once for doing a bit of magic with god forms, and it all worked out very well in the end. But I did tell her about it because she was someone that seemed to be kind of versed in that sort of thing, and her view was that I wasn't supposed to mess with things like that. So, but I did anyhow. I think that the potential for defense of oneself is limited unless you enlist the rest of the universe to your aid. And in taking the limitations off and allowing that force to work is where the light stands in contradistinction to the darkness. Darkness has its place, but it has its functional limitations. The functionality actually rests with the light.
Beautifully put.
Yes.
Yes.
So once you start empowering the people to let go of the fear, this is where Laura Lee's show and a lot of her presentations come. What I have is called contract revocations, the first layer of empowerment for reality, self-reality control, reality deprogramming.
Mm-hmm. And so you would use that as an analog on a social level to our contract with the military-industrial occult complex.
Right. And it could be a simple mantra statement as, I do not consent to the military-industrial complex run by the patriarchal order of our world.
Right. Well,
that's a mantra that can be repeated over and over, and there's so many other things of value that can give people power back.
Right. Right. Well, one of the ways to empower yourself is by taking that stand and then investigating some of what Laura Lee Solomon was talking about. And then, of course, that brings us back to the social matrix in which it takes place. But I'll be happy to go into how that conservative insurgency of Masons infested our North American continent. But, Laura Lee Solomon, how much time do you have left with us?
I've got about 7 minutes.
Okay. So during that 7 minutes, let's have you take the stage and speak with Andrew Bartzies about, we brought up, of course, occult attacks. I think people might be curious because this is all that the public hears about magic. To the majority of a public, not Andrew Bartzies' listenership, but the majority of the general public, all magic is black magic. What, again, would be, say, for instance, you worked with the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. Thanks to Marvel Comics, everybody thinks that that's Aleister Crowley, but of course the history is quite different. Aleister Crowley was expelled. So tell us a bit about what history you know about the Order of the Golden Dawn and why people should have a totally different impression of it.
Well, the Order of the Golden Dawn did have Crowley in it for a significant portion of time, but his sense of his advancement over what they were willing to give him, that is, they didn't automatically just make him the head of the order because he glanced in their direction, pretty much got them taken off his list, and he went and published their stuff. So they threw him out for violation of an oath of secrecy. The order that I was part of was founded by a man who was the head of the Order of the Golden Dawn in the United States. But as that organization became riven by strife, it became kind of, it was on hold for a long time. I understand there's been a resurgence in it, but I was never part of the Golden Dawn either, except in that I was a student of the gentleman who had been head of the order in the States. And he founded Builders of the Adytum so that he could teach what he knew. And what he knew was in the main derived from his own findings and things he was publishing before the Golden Dawn ever got in touch with him. And they were astonished by him because he was publishing things they lightheartedly believed were secret. So that's, yeah, I can't tell you a lot more about the Golden Dawn. I haven't spent a long time prowling through their books of rituals and stuff. A lot of it was published by Israel Regardie.
Right. And your own introduction at such a young age is pretty fascinating, because you've only got a few minutes left with us. When you take off, Andrew Bartzies and I will talk about this more, but one of the things that he brought up that I want to bring up again while you're still with us, because it might excite or stimulate some memories, was the warfare on the magical plane, which, for instance, was engaged in between Aleister Crowley and members of other occult orders, which resulted in physical debilities. It's the same as martial arts combat.
Like a chi punch that leaves only esoteric damage to you.
That's right.
Yeah, I've seen that happen to someone else. It has not happened to me.
I've had it happen to me.
Yeah.
Directly happened to me more than once.
Oh God.
I have experienced
40 or 50.
I have experienced someone working magic on me, and I caught them in their own voice in the back of my head, giving me a series of negative suggestions in verbalized thought, and that's a very basic level.
Those are called remote influencers.
Well,
and there's a whole army of them that are associated to the military that are trained specifically to do exactly what you're talking.
But they should say they would be able to do it undetected if they had any talent.
That's because there's thousands of them that have just a little bit of talent, and those would get better and better that follow the predatorship and begin to murder and kill are able to take that murdering energy and then direct it at your sleeping body.
Yeah. But go on. No, thank you, Mr. Bartzies. And I want to go more into this with you when we return.
I would say that what I have been able to develop as a Kabbalist is a sufficient sense of connection that I am defended. And
right.
I am defended.
A whole being.
I am a whole being in a lot of ways.
Yep.
And where I am not, I am shown what my weaknesses are and how I need to adapt to
and nurture.
And to nurture myself.
Yeah, because without that self-nurturing, you won't go forward. You'll be stuck in neutral as everything's pounding on you.
Well, life exists to be that teacher, and it is a mirror in a lot of ways. And as things happen, you can look in that mirror, and it might not always be the most pleasant of experiences, but you have to roll with that punch that you are actually administering to yourself, and come back up and stabilize again and take the next step forward, which is to address the problems you noticed.
Right. That's looking at your burden basket and understanding it is only your self-reliance to work in your own fertile grounds, to expand your own knowledge and wisdom so that ultimately the ritual of joy can come back to you.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and this is a holistic perspective, as holism and
holism.
Yeah, so that's fantastic. I really appreciate that. Now, you must only have a few minutes left with us, but tell us about.
I've got to go pick up my show now.
Yes, she's going to go pick up your show. Thank you so much, and that's on Friday nights, early Saturday mornings. And where can people find you on Facebook?
On Facebook, I'm under my own name, Laura Lee Solomon. I don't have a public page. I just have my personal page. And, of course, I'm on freedomslitz.com in about 2 minutes' time.
Yes. Okay. You take care, dear lady.
All right, Douglas, let's take a quick break, and then we'll come back to this.
Sounds good. Thank you so much.
Welcome back, everyone. We're continuing our talk with Douglas Dietrich, and now we're going to be talking about our impotent founding fathers.
I'm sorry. That was delightful. Well, it's not necessarily that the founding fathers were impotent. Would that they were, and that they did not pass on the seed of either their accomplishments in terms of social construct or in terms of future generations that would inherit their positions of power that still haunt us today. Rather, I was going to talk about American impotence in light of what I expose, in light, of course, of what Mr. Bartzies has exposed, or what we're offering them in terms of an ability to take control of their own lives. The amazing thing about the American public is it has the ability to be the most empowered population in the world on a far more rapid level of instant gratification than anywhere else in the world, because for a large part it's an armed population. So you have a population where there are more privately owned firearms in the state of Texas alone than there are in the entire United States National Guard. So you have a situation where your tiny military, as I said, less than 1% of the population, being scattered as it is in penny packets all over the world, has no ability to be called back in time to respond to a truly rapid revolution. And a rapid revolution would result in a secession. It would result in, of course, a balkanization into city-states throughout the central CONUS, or continental United States, the midline region of North America as a continent, and there's nothing that the military could do to stop it. They're not going to be able to start bombing the population which pays their taxes, and anyone who thinks that they could do so with any degree of efficiency just needs to look at Iraq, through Afghanistan, through Vietnam. There's nothing that they were able to impose themselves on over there. Why would they be able to impose themselves over here? So believe me, as an armed republic, you have an opportunity to take control of yourself and your destiny, and there's no need to even do that. We're offering you an opportunity to do so through self-empowerment in terms of enhancement of awareness. Now, Andrew Bartzi's been fighting that struggle for quite some time, and I'm here to help contextualize it on a more immediate level. One of the things that we were talking about was the conservative insurgency on the North American continent with the Founding Fathers. Now, what you had with the Founding Fathers was that many of them were Freemasons, and many of these individuals were individuals who were part of a long line of Masonry that was basically dynastic. And so they inherited information, secrets, if you will, in a sense, trade secrets or guild secrets. Now, I'll put this into some perspective for you as to why you are so impotent today. Because for all your guns, for all your so-called ability to speak, and again, that's entirely delusory, you have no freedom of speech. If you had freedom of speech, then, of course, you would have men like Mr. Bradley Manning, now Mrs. Chelsea Manning. You would have men like Edward Snowden. You would have men like, of course, Jeffrey Sterling, or men like Julian Assange walking around as free men. Okay, none of these men are free. And to show you how quickly they can take you down, keep in mind the legal technicalities which have imprisoned Julian Assange under house arrest in the Ecuadorian embassy in the middle of one of the largest, most cosmopolitan cities in the world, the financial capital of Europe and much of the planet, London. He's sitting in the middle of all of this in this tiny little prison, unable to move an inch, dying on his feet, at times threatened with starvation because he lost all appetite and motivation to maintain himself. And here's this individual. What put him in that position? What put him in that position was his penis, his stupidity, his lust that got him involved with two women who were known CIA assets. One of them was a Latina, really hot, who was known as a chick who was deployed on field missions in Cuba. And he's got this other chick. These two ladies get together with him, and this idiot says, "Oh my God, yeah, I'm hot. I'm Julian Assange. They want me. They need me." And of course, they accused him of rape. Now, he was taken to court and, of course, proved the impossibility of rape since there were two of them. It would be impossible to hold him for him to physically hold both of them down, squirming physically beneath him, and one could always break away and get help. So once that was dispensed, how did they wind up extraditing him from Sweden, where he ran away and was considered a fugitive from the law? They extradited him on the basis that the woman finally said, well, he refused to use a prophylactic, a condom, a rubber. And so he was brought in to be tried for unsafe sex. This man is spending the rest of his life in house arrest in an embassy, basically for all intents and purposes in a glorified prison cell. For what reason? For not having safe sex, for refusing to wrap himself in latex. Now, when you get to that point, that's the rationalization that they used to imprison him, condemn him, confine him the rest of his life like a cockroach in a cage because they didn't like what he was saying. How can you sit there in your insanity and say that there's freedom of speech? There's no freedom of speech. If I did not have the collateral to threaten the military-industrial occult complex with, I would be in his position or 6 feet under. So the freedom of speech is something that you earn. It is not a right. It is a privilege. And it is something that you fight for. Now, those of you out there who are the atheistic, rationalist, materialists who skeptically say, well, okay, so this is all bluff. This is based on his sugar pill, which was the analogy that we used prior to the break. And the sugar pill to you is a poison pill that these men do not want to swallow because they know much more than you. That's why they're in power. It's not just the guns. It's also the knowledge. It's this knowledge.
And the knowledge of how to use fear to create a society that can never get out of its own delusion.
And this is what rationalizes Americans into impotence. And their delusion is, Douglas Dietrich can't be telling me this, or he would be in the Ecuadorian embassy, or he would be in Moscow, or he'd be in a concrete hole rotting someplace, like Jeffrey Sterling, where we never would have heard of him. And they don't take into account that that fear that infects you infects the men who manipulate you, the puppet masters. They are, in turn, puppets on their own strings of believing their own propaganda, their own lies, their own voodoo, if you will, if you're an atheistic, rationalist, materialist, or, in another sense, they know the potency and the metaphysics of what they have harnessed, and, of course, they know enough to fear the consequences of its unleashing. Now, it's not something like the nuclear codes, which you can change. These entities are called forth by what are known as barbarous names. Barbarous names are referred to as such because they're literally unpronounceable.
The Cthulian names.
Yes, the ancient Grecian, or Greek, from which Andrew Barthes hails from, of course, the ancient culture of Greece. And here was a culture that ran into the North Africans during the heyday of its empire and colonization. And, of course, it ran into the Tuaregs, the Berbers, the Arab peoples, their descendants, or ancestors, if you will. The Arab peoples are descendants of these Tuareg or nomadic tribes, these Berbers. And these Berbers spoke a language, they're called such, their name is derivative of the sounds of their language, which to the ancient Greeks, the people of Andrew Barthes, from which he hails from, that culture, that to them, all of these semi-nomadic tribes, the people who were down the Nile Delta, everyone in the region of North Africa going towards the Pillars of Hercules and the Atlantic Ocean, all of these people, their language sounded like barbar, 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 hence the name Berber or barbarian. That's where we got the term Barbary Coast. The North African coast, the slave trading coast, was known as the Barbary Coast, which then became the name, properly enough, for San Francisco, and the Embarcadero, where one would embark into such areas from or to the Barbary Coast of the world, because the slave trade was the energy source of the ancient Greek and Roman empires. That was their version of electricity.
All of their cities were built in a sacred geometry structure, just like the way Washington, D.C. is, to house, hold, and store the esoteric energy for future generations or the current generation's projection of power.
And, of course, run, in terms of energy, by the treadmills, so to speak, the turning wheels, the grinding, mechanisms of the slaves that were flogged into turning such wheels, from which their hydrogen, their hydroelectric energy was derived, which was very much, of course, a part of those empires that's little understood today, but the human version of hamster wheels, if you will.
Right, and then you have the other level is once those slaves died, they imprinted on an area a whole ghost pattern, which is also part of the esoteric infrastructure of the Masons, is to have large volumes of ghosts in particular areas, and they can use their rituals to affect a population.
Yes, and that's what brings us back to the Founding Fathers. Thank you so much. And, of course, your modern, human hamster wheel is known as your 9-to-5 job, or whatever you're working.
Whatever slave job you're in.
Yes, for all you wage slaves out there who are ignorant enough to delude yourself into thinking you have freedom of speech, and that somehow, simply because I'm able to talk, that must mean I'm just like you. I'm not like you. I have the occult equivalent of the nuclear football, whose code cannot be changed, and its barbarous names are imprinted into the mechanism from which it is understood that I could unleash these various entropic entities simultaneously and impact the space and time, the very fabric thereof, of the world around us and all near space within our interplanetary solar system, etc. So this is something that
beautifully put.
Thank you.
Beautifully put, because you hold that code, that exact code, and everyone else has their own individual code that will break down the delusionary reality. But you're talking the code that affects the many scales of reality that are interacting on this world right now.
That's correct. And it was something that was created at great cost. The mechanism is known as the Vox Arca, or the voice box,
Mm-hmm.
and it is through this that the human vocal cords can utter the barbarous names, or those
Right.
which are impossible to pronounce using human vocal cords alone, that call
Or
for science.
Or on another level, you can use your out loud power voice to deprogram the reality that's manifesting around you.
That's what we're doing now with your help.
Yes,
And
with our help.
that brings us back. So what about this concept that Americans have in their impotence that they rationalize themselves into? Okay, say they get over that and say, okay, we get over the binding mechanism. The binding mechanism that is on the American mind is that whoever speaks up and is telling the truth is going to be put down. And therefore, no one has the ability to do anything, and yet they delude themselves into thinking they have freedom of speech. But the only way they use that freedom is to basically attack myself, the messenger, or anyone else who has a message of any import when it comes to deconstructing their binding mechanism. So when
Exactly.
we get into
With their binding mechanism, which is their esoteric infrastructure.
Yes. So when we get into this, okay, say you get past that. So we overcome that, and you can say, okay, I accept that. I'm going to crawl out of the box. I'm going to get off the hamster wheel. I'm going to, basically stop providing my psychic energy to the hydroelectric power, so to speak, the aether electric power that is being used by my societal machine that is exploiting
the Babylonian business plan of we are commerce and chattel.
Yes, the ergonomic machine, which uses units of labor, or ergonomics, or in this case, units of your psychic energy towards just draining your battery for the sake of keeping the financial mechanism going, which manifests itself physically as skyscrapers. That's how our financial machine manifests itself. That's the visual imprint into our three-dimensional world of the power of money. Okay, so you've got this situation where you're saying, okay, I get it now. So were we ever once better than this? Were we not something that was this great shining city on the hill, this democracy, this republic that somehow got tainted by all of these military people? No, it was bad from the start. When it comes to the Founding Fathers,
Satanocracy.
yes, these individuals were of the level of masonry, as I said, that was dynastic, that you could see senescent or divergent schismatic break-offs from the dregs, the dropouts, in the form of people like Edward Leeds Scullman or Howard Phillips Lovecraft, both of who led completely miserable lives that ended miserably. Someone like Edward Leeds Scullman was a Latvian immigrant, the nation from which Marvel Comics portrayed Dr. Doom as emerging from, and this individual from the Baltic coast of Latvia, the littoral nations of the German order of knights that overtook the Balticum, Mare Balticum, or the Baltic League. This individual from out of that matrix came to the United States and built Coral Castle. And Edward Leeds Scullman claimed that he knew the secrets of the building of the pyramids. Now, these were passed down by the Masons, who got their name because of stonemasonry. And so the Masons were technical, architectural engineers whose secrets of construction went back not just to the pyramids, but supposedly to Atlantis, which supposedly they boasted about bringing an end to because they had ushered in these very extra-cosmic entities, these entropic weapons of cosmic destruction of which I allude to, controlled or unleashed by the Vox Arca, and that they brought them into our reality, which led to the demolition, the destruction, the decimation of the continent of Atlantis, whether you interpret that as a physical sinking or the decimation of its culture worldwide on a continental level that spanned the supercontinent of Pangaea, or perhaps whichever continent you feel Atlantis was tethered to as a culture or a concept. It was destroyed in a cataclysm that involved these extracosmic entities. So there was
who destroyed their frequency of time, their ability to have ancestors, eliminated from us, and that's why we are a race with amnesia that's constantly fighting this propaganda.
Yes. So these founding fathers, who are heir to this tradition, which is nothing to be proud of, this memory that they retain of racial cataclysm and catastrophe, which everyone else experiences as amnesia. These keepers of the memory, these hoarders of the memory, these people who maintain their power by maintaining that memory amongst themselves and denying it from you. These people had, at the time of Francis Bacon, conceived of a new Atlantis. Now, the new Atlantis that Francis Bacon conceived of was located in the Pacific, specifically in the Bismarck Archipelago. And in terms of his concept, however, it came to be applied on the North American continent that was known of by Sir Thomas More, who wrote the book Utopia. And Sir Thomas More wrote the book Utopia in full knowledge of sailors and traders, merchants and navigators who had landed in the Western Hemisphere long before Columbus. And these
long before Columbus.
Yes, and these people brought back stories, tales, realities, recountants, first-hand accounts of the Taino natives, the Indians, who had no laws, walked around spangled in gold, which had no meaning to them other than its splendor and its glitter, and otherwise had no concept of it in terms of a precious metal. It reflected the sun, and they wore it upon their naked bodies. They picked fruit off the trees. They speared fish from the waters. They had no concept of money, no concept of war. When Columbus landed on the island of Hispaniola and waved his sword, they grabbed it thinking it was a gift and cut their own fingers off, having never seen a blade of war before. And that's when he wrote in his own journals and diaries, "I can kill all of them with but a score of men. A mere 10 or 20 of us could kill hundreds of them. They have no concept of conflict." So this was Utopia. This is what Sir Thomas More alluded to, which is why he placed Utopia in the New World, in the Western Hemisphere. Well, the Founding Fathers came here to taint it with a desire to turn this into the new Atlantis they would sink and bring into the dirt so that their destruction could be final. So by destroying this continent and the Western Hemisphere, they would ascend to the position of gods by destruction, because these were deists. By the time of Sir Isaac Newton, the man who basically created the mechanisms of the physical universe in his mind that we came to understand our universe to work by, this created the concept of the clockwork universe created by a divinity, a god who created it and left it unattended. The universe of a god gone away. That's where the concept of deism evolved. Deism, D-E-I-S-M. That was the religion of your founding fathers, the religion that made them think that all the Gothic cathedrals they were contracted to build in Europe as stonemasons were monuments to man's ignorance. They felt these to be temples, houses of a god gone away. And ultimately, in this world, they would usurp the power of that divinity by inhabiting, occupying the throne of God himself. And so,
right. Thus the Pope, the Sesta Act. See, this is where I say they began to conquer all the little local bubbles of reality until finally what we are in this disunity, joined, shared reality rules planet.
Well, in terms of what they created in the North American continent, the bloodshed, the violence, the genocide initiated by Christopher Columbus was ultimately carried to its logical conclusion by themselves. George Washington was known as the village burner in the Mohawk language.
Yep.
He was responsible for surrounding villages, setting them aflame, and exterminating by gunfire all the elderly, the women, the children, when they exited the villages to flee the flames so they wouldn't burn alive. He killed hundreds of thousands of Indians personally in charge of such operations. The man was a mass murderer and a criminal. And this was your founding father, your first president. And anyone who admires him or any of the founding fathers is a fool. These were plantation-owning, slave-owning, misogynists whose idea of your vote was based on your being a white, propertied male.
Right. Who had come from Europe and was saying this is our land.
Yes. And, of course, the reason for the revolution, the conservative insurgency, was based on the fact that the king, George III, said, thus far and no further. He drew the line and issued the royal proclamation saying that you will advance no more beyond the Appalachian Mountains. The rest is France. That belongs to France. And it was during the war that we call World War Zero, the Napoleonic conflicts, that, of course, Napoleon Bonaparte became so broke that to finance his war effort, he sold, of course, the Louisiana Purchase.
Yep.
Yes, and then at that point, America bordered directly Russia and Spain. Until that point in time, America, of course, was simply a maritime republic on the Atlantic seaboard bordering France. Now,
right. Well, that's why we have all of our maritime laws that are defining us as lost at sea.
Yes, yes. Well, you may as well, and certainly that's been the foreign policy of America ever since. It has been one thing they've been anchored to, and that was their concept, their need, their desire, their obsession with destroying Europe. Because these were a nation of emigres from Europe who hated Europe, were cowards and traitors who came to the United States, slavers.
And they stole the great fortunes of Europe and brought them here.
Yes, and used this continent and the treasure of this continent, which they stole from the Native Americans, to try and destroy Europe. That is your founding fathers. And
countless numbers of treaties that were completely ignored, where the chiefs of the tribe came directly to the White House, etc. We've all heard it, but ignore it.
Yes, and in terms of these awful men, these criminals, the men who founded the Republic, this was a constitutional republic in which the propertied white male could vote. It was intended no one else would, no black, no slave, no woman, and it's patterned on the Greek democracy, which was, of course, a Slavocracy of men who were voting while suppressing women and their slaves. So it was very much based on that. That's exactly why Andrew Bartzi said they wanted the initial language to be Hellenic Greek. So this is something patterned on that failed experiment, overtaken by the garrison state of the Roman Empire, and this terrible republic, this criminal constitutional republic, which fought against the British Empire in order to conquer this North American continent from sea to sea so that it could take all of its resources and employ them against its home continent, its source land of Europe, its homeland, and destroy it, to create an Atlantean catastrophe that would usher in the age of these anti-gods, in which by the destruction of the world itself they could ascend to the throne of God, assume the godhood themselves. These were the mad dreams of your founding fathers. Once you come to terms with that, you realize there is no golden age, no past ideals for you to look to. You have to dismiss it all. What will be born upon the North American continent will be a new culture based on your divorcing yourself from these delusions.
And beautifully put, divorcing yourself from the delusions.
And deconstructing the matrix of this illusory mirage, the matrix of the mirage, which basically keeps you impotent. So instead of relying on your freedom of speech, then you need to act. And the first thing to do to act is to incorporate the facts, the reality of what I'm exposing to you, and say, hey, the founding fathers were villains. I want nothing to do with them. Their constitutional republic is not my republic. Our republic is coming to a close. It's been conquered by the military-industrial complex. We live underneath a junta. I will no longer give money to it, and I will advocate to Congress that we want to stop funding it, and then eventually you will deconstruct the military complex by your awareness thereof, by your spreading of this awareness, and ultimately we will see a sea change. And ultimately what will defend you from your own military, far before any foreign invaders, will be your right to bear arms, which is a privilege that no one can take from you because you're armed. So take advantage of that and, of course, realize your freedom by defending yourself if they come for you. But the way to prevent that is to dismantle them and deconstruct them by stop funding them. Just cessation of funding. And
in the old days, it was pitchforks and torches that changed this world and stopped the imprinting of the old orders. And in this world, it's weaponized information that's the new pitchforks and torches.
yes, which is what we're delivering to you. Now, I don't know exactly when my good friend Mr. Barces is going to have this up, but when he sends me the link, we'll have it up, which should be about, I assume, maybe tomorrow or 48 hours, 72 hours?
Probably it'll be up on Monday.
Okay, that sounds good.
Yeah.
And then
It's Friday night. It should be up on Monday.
I look forward to the link. He's going to provide that to me by both the Skype and a Facebook private message, and then I will also distribute that with an illustration and a summary he provides on my timelines, his timelines, and we'll certainly be happy to share this with you, hopefully, knock on wood, come Monday. And this is the risk we take. Whenever we do a pre-recording, there's always a potential for sabotage by external factors. It happened to me with the lovely young Denise Chavez of Beyond Ordinary News, and her entire recording of our pre-recording was taken, just erased. I've
had that happen to me so many times, Douglas. It's ridiculous.
Oh, God, I hope that doesn't happen to us tonight. But
no, we're doing good so far.
Thank God. At any rate, it's just one of those things that can be very demotivating with the work that we put into this. But now that we've discussed the Founding Fathers, I do want people to know we will be back together again, Mr. Barces and I. We're going to discuss some of the other populations which are hidden from your appreciation of reality, the relic populations that have been on our planet and other planets within our solar system prior to humanity. And these, of course, are in no way, shape, or form somehow anti-biblical or non-biblical. In other words, they are canonical to many people who live within the Christian cosmology. Both Andrew Barces and myself come from a Byzantine Orthodox background. He was born into one, the Greek Orthodox Church. Of course, he's moved on. He's got a new cosmology, which he has adapted to. I myself am a member of the Serbian Orthodox Church, and I'll probably discuss that in the future when I'm doing my own interviews that are coming up with other people on my program. So I do want to remind people to join myself on Saturdays and Tuesdays. I'm on twice a week from 10 to midnight Atlantic Seaboard time. So in other words, Eastern Daylight Time, it's Eastern Daylight now, or Eastern Standard Time, I'm on 10 to midnight. And in terms of the Pacific Coast, I'm on 7 p.m. to 8 to 9 p.m. At night. And so just bear that in mind for Saturdays and Tuesday nights. On Topical Tuesdays, I usually hold a monologue, and on Saturday Night Firing Lines, I take calls from yourself to ask any questions that you wish, so long as they're asked with respect. And certainly, we have to knock off the air anyone who uses improper language, who makes slurs or defamatory remarks against individuals or ethnic or sexual orientation or gender groups, etc. Obviously, this is, again, to put a lie to the concept of freedom of speech. Speech is not free. Speech is responsibility. Speech is like gun ownership. You have to watch what you are saying. You cannot go anywhere and say, stick 'em up. You cannot yell fire in a crowded theater. So when you're on air in front of more people than you're ever going to physically meet in a lifetime, you call in to ask myself a question. You don't threaten a lawsuit to myself or the staff or Revolution Radio itself will knock you off the air. Mr. Barces was involved with Revolution Radio before he moved on to his own program as a host, and he knows the score no matter where you're at, on what venue, and therefore just need to reemphasize that. It's a shame that I have to, but such is the world that we live in. We no longer have a social matrix which educates people in the responsibility of speech, but instead deludes them with this illusion, this mirage of freedom thereof. Okay, you don't have that. You never have, you never will, nor should you, any more than you have a right with a firearm to take out a bunch of loaded firearms from your private arsenal and pass them out in the schoolyard. So you have to watch yourself, watch what you say, and again, Saturday Night Firing Lines, call in 10 to midnight Saturday night. Ask me anything you want, speak of anything you want within the parameters I've just unfortunately had to outline. And then you have to, unfortunate because I shouldn't have to outline that, you should grow up knowing that, but the majority of you don't. And
So you're on freedomslips.com, Revolution Radio, and your Facebook. How do people get a hold of you?
Thank you very much for reminding me of that. That's www.freedomslips.com. Once again, that's freedomslips.com. Look that up. I'm on Studio A, 10 to midnight Eastern Time. Then, of course, reach me on Facebook through facebook.com/DouglasDuaneDietrich. Douglas is spelled with one S. Duane is spelled D-U-A-N-E. And my last name, my surname, is the same as that of the famous actress Marlene Dietrich, who is a distant relation of mine. For you young people who don't remember her, sadly, you just put the words diet and rich together. In other words, D-I-E-T-R-I-C-H, diet rich. Just spell it like that. So Douglas Duane Diet Rich, Facebook.com/DouglasDuaneDietrich. You know, you can reach me there by a private message. I do not review my direct instant private messages. My executive producer, Laura Lee Solomon, does, but she'll alert me to anything that you might have to ask me or present to me through private messages. Also, you can contact me on Facebook by direct posting. I allow direct posts. Of course, we do police them. Anyone who puts up pornography, something obscene, marketing, spamming, of course, that gets taken down, etc. People who transgress civil behavior or what are known as community standards on Facebook. Of course, we have to honor that. Broach of that would get my Facebook taken down. Now, what I gave you as facebook.com/DouglasDuaneDietrich is the public community fan page. Put a like on it, please, so I don't have to pay to maintain it. That will help immensely. Otherwise, you can friend me on my personal friends page at facebook.com/DouglasDuaneDietrich. So do check out both timelines, and of course, freedomslips.com for my programs on Saturdays and Tuesday nights, 10 to midnight Eastern. So I think we pretty much covered it, and Andrew Barthes and I will be back again, threatening the powers that be simply by our very existence. Maintain him in your thoughts and prayers. He's under constant attack. He's under constant siege. And comparatively speaking, what I go through is mild compared to what a lot of Andrew Barthes goes through.
Thanks, Douglas.
Yeah.
And this means a lot to me to have this interview because so much of what you say and I say just comes from a different perspective, the imprints of the reality, the falseness that we've dealt with.
Yeah.
So for everyone that's out there, thank you very much. It is with your intent of self-nurturing that you can advance forward into self-reflection. And in self-reflection, you can see the humor and opposite of the world we're living in, where the esoteric orders have power, but it is the innocent inner child who can reclaim the faith of their inner victories and once again walk the road of all the viewpoints and options, unlimited in their own selves. And in an unlimited self, you can begin the purification and the returning home to your authentic self, not imprinted by this esoteric world we live in. Thanks a lot, everyone. And when we come back for another interview in a couple of weeks, we're going to talk about the relic species, time traveler, and all the other things that are going to be invested in what's going on. Thanks a lot, everyone.